Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I arrived at the boarding house with a single suitcase and a small backpack. The building was old, with faded green paint on the outside and a front door that creaked every time someone walked in. Inside, the hallway smelled like damp wood and cheap cleaning supplies. The landlady showed me my room on the second floor. She was a short, older woman with thin hair and thick glasses. Her voice was quiet, and she moved slowly, as if she didn't want to draw attention to herself. She gave me a key and pointed to my door. Across the hall, there was another door. She never mentioned who stayed there. My room was simple, just a bed, a small table, a wooden chair, and a chest of drawers. The window overlooked a narrow alley. I could see a brick wall and a few trash cans. There was no lamp on the ceiling, only a cheap floor lamp in the corner and a dim light bulb in it. The mattress was thin, and the sheets smelled clean but old. I placed my suitcase beside the bed and sat down. I could hear muffled voices somewhere downstairs and footsteps coming up the stairs as someone passed by. The floorboards creaked loudly, a sound that seemed to echo through the building. Later that first evening, I started to notice something about the room across the hall. I had not seen anyone go in or out of it. The door was plain, with chipped paint and a dull brass knob, but from inside I heard soft sounds. It sounded like someone dragging their feet back and forth on the wood floor. Sometimes there was a low voice, barely audible, like someone whispering to themselves. I heard a constant creaking noise too, as if the floor inside that room had a loose board and the person kept stepping on it again and again. I left my room a few times that evening to use the shared bathroom at the end of the hall. Each time I paused and looked at that door. I never saw it open. I never heard the knob turn. Still, the noises continued. I listened closely, pressing my ear to my own door when I was inside, but the sounds were always faint and hard to place. I thought maybe the building was old and the pipes or walls made strange noises, but it sounded more like footsteps and a voice than anything else. The second night, I tried to sleep, but woke up around midnight. The corridor was quiet, and I felt thirsty. I opened my door, intending to go down to the kitchen area to get some water. The hall was lit by a single dim bulb. The door across from mine stood closed as always. I stopped in front of it. I listened. I heard something faint inside. Scraping sounds, like nails on wood, and quiet shuffling steps. I leaned forward and placed my ear close to the surface of the door. I could hear slow breathing. It was not mine. It came from the other side. I knocked softly, expecting whoever was inside to respond. Nothing happened. I knocked again, a bit louder. No answer. The breathing sound stopped. I felt the tiny hairs on my arms rise. I didn't say anything. I stepped back and waited. The hall was silent except for the distant hum of the old refrigerator downstairs. Eventually, I turned around and went to get my water. When I returned, I listened again, but I heard nothing. On the third day, I asked the landlady about the room. She looked at me with a blank expression. She shrugged and said someone rented it. She did not say if it was a man or a woman. She didn't even confirm that the person was still there. She turned around and walked away before I could ask more. I tried asking one of the other tenants, a man who stayed on the first floor. He said he didn't know anything about the person in that room. He said he never saw them either. That evening, I noticed something else. The hallway light cast shadows on the floor and walls. I had become familiar with the shape of the furniture in the corridor. A small table with a vase next to the stairway, a coat rack near the front door downstairs, and a tall old clock at the end of the hall on the second floor. But the shadows near the door across from mine seemed off. I stood there, looking at the floor and walls. The shadows didn't match anything I could see. There was no furniture that would create those shapes. They looked like narrow shapes moving slightly, but there was nothing there. I went closer and saw that the shadows shifted as I moved, but not in a way that made sense. I leaned over and tried to figure out what object could cause them. I ended up confused. I saw only the bare wooden floor, plain walls, and that closed door. Yet the shapes persisted for a few seconds and then were gone. I returned to my room and shut the door. My heart was beating fast. I stood by the door for a long time, just holding the doorknob and listening. I heard those slow footsteps again, the dragging steps, like someone shuffling without lifting their feet. I heard a whispering voice. It was impossible to make out words. It sounded weak and constant, as if the person was talking to themselves or reciting something. I stayed quiet and tried to control my breathing. My mouth felt dry and my neck was tense. I pressed my ear against my door and listened. The whispering went on for at least a minute, then stopped. Silence. I finally let go of the knob and stepped back. That night, I struggled to sleep. I kept waking up. Each time I listened for noise. Sometimes I heard it, sometimes I didn't. In the morning, I got up and decided to inspect that door up close. I waited until the house was quiet, around mid-morning, when others seemed to be out. I walked up to the door and ran my fingers over its surface. The paint was peeling. Near the lower half of the door, I found marks. They were scratches, thin and uneven, as if someone with jagged nails had scraped at the wood. They went in short, straight lines, clustered together. They were fresh enough that I could feel splinters where the wood had been torn. I knelt down and looked closely. There was no paint chipped in the scratch marks, as if they were new. I touched them, then pulled my hand back. I stared at that door for a while, then stood up and walked away. Inside my chest, my heart pounded. The back of my neck felt hot. As the afternoon passed, I tried to focus on normal activities. I took a short walk outside, visited a small store down the street, and returned with some canned food and bottled water. I tried not to think about that door or the scratches. I sat on my bed and ate a simple meal. But even then, I could not stop glancing at my door, as if expecting something to happen. The building felt too quiet. I could hear the traffic outside, people talking on the sidewalk, but inside it felt like no one else existed. That evening, I decided to stay awake. I placed a chair near my door and kept my ear close to it. I waited. Around 11 at night, I heard the familiar dragging footsteps. They were slow. I heard them move from one side of that room to the other and then back again. I heard the floorboards squeak in a pattern, as if someone paced. Then I heard that whispering voice. It sounded like a single person, quiet, breathing between words. I could not make sense of the sounds. They were too soft and mumbled. I did not dare to step into the hallway. I stayed behind my door and listened. My stomach tightened. My hands felt cold and clammy. I was very aware of my own breathing and tried to keep it silent. After a few minutes, the whispering stopped. The steps stopped. I leaned forward and listened harder. Then I heard a gentle scraping sound, like nails on wood again. It lasted a few seconds and stopped. Silence. At that point, I felt frustrated. I wanted to know who was in there. I wanted to see them. I did not want to keep guessing. I opened my door softly and stepped out. The hallway light was dim as always. The other door remained closed. Everything looked still. I approached it. I thought about knocking again, but my hand froze. I noticed something new. Near the doorknob, there were more scratch marks. They were smaller and arranged in a way that made it look like someone had gripped the door near the knob, scratching at it. I leaned in and sniffed. The door smelled like old wood and dust, nothing else. I pressed my ear against it. I heard nothing, not even breathing. I tried the knob. It was locked. I twisted it gently, but it would not budge. I knocked, louder this time. No answer. I put my face close to the wood and spoke quietly, asking if anyone was there. Nothing. Silence. I stepped back and looked around. The hallway was empty. The shadows looked normal this time. I backed away to my room and went inside, closing the door. My heart beat fast and my legs felt weak. I sat on the bed, stared at the floor, and rubbed my hands together. The next morning, I confronted the landlady. I asked her firmly who lived in that room. She shrugged and said I should not worry about it. She said the person in there was private and liked to be left alone. She refused to say more and walked away. I tried asking another tenant, but he said he never saw anyone and suggested maybe the room was empty. He laughed and changed the subject. I stood in the downstairs hallway, feeling uneasy. I considered leaving the boarding house, but I had paid rent for the month and didn't have extra money to move elsewhere right now. That afternoon, I hovered near the top of the stairs, watching the hallway. I saw no one come in or out of that room. Occasionally, I heard movement inside my own room, the old building creaking as if someone walked in the room next door. I leaned over the railing and looked down the staircase, expecting maybe to see a stranger, but no one came. In the early evening, I decided to try something different. I pulled my chair close to my door again, turned off my lamp, and waited in the dark. I pressed my ear against the door. For a long time, there was nothing. I began to feel foolish. I wondered if maybe I was imagining these noises. But then I heard it again, dragging steps, slow and deliberate. I opened my door a crack, just enough to peek into the hallway. I could see the other door dimly lit by the corridor light. I saw the doorknob turn, just a slight movement, but the door did not open. I held my breath. The doorknob twisted again, but only a fraction. Then it stopped. I heard a scraping sound like nails scratching. The door shook slightly. Then it was still. I stepped out quietly. My heart was pounding. I approached the door, moving slowly. My feet felt heavy. I reached out and touched the knob. It was cold and still. I tried it again. Still locked. I pressed my ear to the door. I heard a quiet breathing sound, very close. It sounded like someone standing right behind the door. I pulled back and took a step away. I felt a strong urge to leave. I wanted to get out of this building. But I stayed. I watched the door for a long time, just standing there in silence. Nothing happened. I returned to my room and sat on the bed. I considered calling the police or asking someone else to help me break down the door, but I had no proof of anything illegal. There was just someone in there who never came out. It was strange, but not necessarily a crime. I thought about the scratches, the whispering, the footsteps. I tried to figure out what kind of person behaved like that. Maybe they were sick or disabled. Maybe they were afraid to leave their room, but then why the whispering at night and the scratching sounds? As days passed, I tried to ignore it. I went about my business, leaving for a few hours each day to go to the library or walk around town. But every time I returned, I heard some sign that the person in that room was still there. I never saw them enter or exit. I never got a glimpse of their face or their figure. At night, I still heard their footsteps and voice. Some nights it was quiet, and I almost managed to sleep peacefully. Other nights the sounds went on, making my skin crawl. One morning I woke up after a restless night and decided to try one last time to open that door. I knew it was locked. I had no key, but I wanted to see if maybe there was another way in. The building had only one hallway on that floor, and the rooms were all in a row. There was no adjoining door from my room. I checked the windows. The room across from mine should have a similar window facing the alley. I looked outside from my window. I saw my own reflection in the glass and the brick wall opposite. I leaned out carefully. There was another window, presumably from that room, a few feet to the right. It was closed, and the curtain inside was drawn. I could not see in. I considered climbing out and trying to look inside, but the gap was too narrow, and I would have to risk hanging off the ledge. I was not going to do that. I went out into the hall again. I tried the knob, still locked. I knocked and said that I just wanted to talk, to know if they needed help. No response. I pressed my ear to the door. I heard quiet breathing inside. I said I would leave them alone if they just told me they were all right. Nothing. I felt frustration boiling in my chest. I turned around and walked downstairs. The landlady saw me and asked if everything was fine. I said yes, just needed some air. I left the house and spent the day outside. I ate lunch at a small cafe. I tried not to think about it. That evening I returned. As soon as I entered the building, I felt tense. I climbed the stairs slowly. The hallway light flickered as I reached the top. The other door was closed. My door was as I left it. Inside my room, everything looked normal. I sat down and waited, listening. I heard faint movement next door again, but I decided not to react. I did not approach the door. I forced myself to lie down and close my eyes. I listened, but I did nothing. The footsteps and whispers continued for a while, then stopped. I heard a gentle scraping sound. I tensed but remained in bed. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep. Over the next few days, I avoided the door entirely. Whenever I passed it, I did not stop. At night, when I heard sounds, I put a pillow over my head. I tried not to think about the scratches or the strange shadows. Occasionally, I noticed new marks on the door, but I ignored them. I saw the doorknob tremble sometimes, but I did not touch it again. I heard breathing. I heard whispering. I heard those dragging footsteps. I let it all happen and did nothing. By the end of the month, my rent was up. I packed my things in the morning. I did not say goodbye to the landlady. I took my suitcase and backpack, walked down the stairs, and left the building. I looked back once through the front door. The hallway inside was dim. I could see the top of the stairs, and I knew that door was up there. I knew that whoever was inside was still walking, whispering and scraping, locked away and unseen. I walked out onto the street and didn't look back. I felt relieved to get away. I still have no explanation for what I experienced in that boarding house. I know what I heard and what I saw on that door. The memory still makes me tense, but I have nothing else to say. I left, and I never went back. I entered the old mansion late in the afternoon. The rental agreement was simple. The owner stayed away. I had the key, and it was all mine for as long as I could pay. Outside, the hill was covered in thick fog. I could barely see the path. My car's headlights reflected against wet leaves and warped wooden fences. The driver's seat was uncomfortable. My back was sore. I had to carry my suitcase and a box of supplies up the front steps. The door creaked. The smell inside the entry hall reminded me of old furniture, damp floors, and stale air. There was a light switch on the wall. It worked, but the bulb was weak. The room remained dim. I noticed silence, except for my own breathing and the soft hum of my car's engine cooling outside. I locked the front door and walked through the downstairs rooms. There was a living room filled with heavy chairs, a sofa, and a low table. Dust floated in the air. There was a dining room with a long table and a row of old chairs, some missing their cushions. The kitchen had a stone floor, an old refrigerator, and a gas stove with a spark igniter. The counters were worn, the shelves empty except for a few glasses and plates. A back door led outside, but the fog and darkness pressed against the window panes. I decided not to go out again that night. I carried my things upstairs. The steps were uneven. The banister felt rough under my hand. There were 4 bedrooms along the hall. I chose the one at the far end because it had a bed without a ripped mattress. I put my suitcase on the floor, opened it, and took out my toothbrush, a bar of soap, and a towel. The bathroom was across the hall. The pipes groaned when I turned on the faucet. The water ran brown for a moment before turning clear. I washed my face and dried it. My skin felt cold. I noticed a strange tension in my stomach. Maybe it was the silence or the fog or the old wood smell. Back in the bedroom, I tried to unpack. I took out some clothes and hung them in a small closet. The closet door squeaked. I placed my shoes by the bed. The floorboards made soft creaks. I checked the windows. They were closed. The glass was cloudy. I couldn't see outside, only a faint gray blur. I decided to lie down for a moment before exploring more. My back ached from the drive. The mattress was firm, a bit lumpy, but better than sleeping in the car. I was dozing off when I heard a sound in the hallway. It was a soft tap, like a footstep. I froze and listened. I heard nothing more. Maybe the old pipes or the wind. I sat up and walked to the door. I opened it slowly. The hallway was empty. dim light from a single bulb in the ceiling. I looked left, then right. No one there, no sound. I closed the door and locked it. I returned to bed. I woke up to darkness. The light bulb I had left on in the bedroom was off. I felt along the bedside table. The switch was on. I tried it back and forth. No response. I got up and moved toward the window. I held my hands out to avoid bumping into anything. I reached the door and opened it. The hallway light was still on, so at least there was some illumination. I felt relief seeing that pale glow. I went back into the room and flipped the switch again. Nothing. The bulb must have burned out. I didn't feel like sleeping in the dark. I went to get a spare bulb if I could find one. I searched the hallway closet. There were old linens and a broom, but no bulbs. I tried the other bedrooms, opening doors carefully. I saw beds covered with sheets, empty dressers, and dusty floors. Nothing useful. I heard a whisper in the corridor. It made my scalp tingle. It sounded like someone speaking softly in another room. I followed the sound. It seemed to come from the direction of the stairs. I walked slowly, my socks silent on the wooden floor. At the top of the stairs, I leaned over the banister and looked down. The entry hall was dark. The whispering sound repeated, but I couldn't understand any words. I stood there holding my breath. My heart thumped. Then I saw something move at the far end of the hallway. A quick shape, dark, and without detail. I turned my head to focus, but it was gone. I gripped the banister harder. My knuckles felt stiff. I couldn't tell if I was imagining things or if someone was really here. I decided to go downstairs. I tried to act calm. The steps creaked louder at night. I stepped into the living room. The furniture looked the same, but now the silence pressed harder on my ears. I wanted to find a lamp, something portable. I spotted a small desk lamp in a corner. It was old-fashioned with a green shade and a brass base. I unplugged it and carried it to the wall socket near the couch. It flickered but stayed on. Good, at least some light. I considered taking the lamp upstairs, but I would need an extension cord. I didn't have one handy. I sighed and rubbed my eyes. Maybe I was tired. Maybe old houses had strange acoustics. I went to the library next. It was a long room with tall shelves. Most shelves were empty. Others had a few thick books with cracked spines. The floor was covered with a thin rug. The air smelled musty. I stepped inside and looked at the desk in the corner. A few loose papers lay on it, and a small wooden box with a sliding lid. I approached and heard a whisper again. It was very faint. It made my neck tense. I spun around and saw no one. My heart rate went up. I could feel the pulse in my ears. I breathed through my mouth to stay quiet. I reached out to touch one of the books. It felt dry and rough. I turned the cover. Inside were old handwritten notes, but the ink had faded. I couldn't read them in the low light. I tried the desk lamp switch on the desk, but it didn't turn on. I felt along the wall for a light switch. I found one and flipped it. One overhead bulb lit up the library. The whispers faded, replaced by a hollow silence. I turned back to the desk and checked the drawers. Empty. I examined the wooden box. It was empty too. Just dust inside. I left everything as it was and turned to leave. When I reached the door, I noticed a shape at the far end of the room near the shelves. I stood still, staring. The shape seemed like a person's outline, but with no features. I backed up, keeping my eyes on it. It didn't move. I felt a chill on my arms and neck. The hair on my arms stood up. I stepped back again, and the shape vanished. It was like a blink. One moment it was there, and then gone. I walked out, breathing hard. I rubbed my face. I felt sweat on my forehead. I told myself to calm down. There was no sound now, no footsteps. I returned to the living room. The lamp was still on. Everything was normal there. I sat on the sofa and waited. I tried to think. Objects wouldn't move by themselves. People wouldn't vanish without a sound. Maybe I was too tired. Maybe I needed sleep. but I also felt watched. I looked behind me, checked each corner. No one. I decided to test something. I placed my keys on the low table in front of me. I watched them for a full minute. They didn't move. I got up, left the keys on the table, and went to the kitchen. I opened the fridge. It was empty. I drank water from the tap. It tasted metallic. I splashed some on my face. When I came back to the living room, the keys were gone. I had left them right in the center of the table. Now the table was empty. I bent down to check the floor, the cushions, under the sofa. Nothing. My heart pounded again. I felt a hollow pressure in my chest. I stood up quickly and looked around. Nothing. I was alone in a silent room and my keys had disappeared. I called out, "Who's here?" My voice echoed slightly. No answer. I checked behind the curtains, under the furniture, inside drawers. I didn't find my keys. I tried to keep calm, but my legs were shaking. I went upstairs again. The hallway was quiet. I entered my bedroom, and on the bed, I saw my keys. They were right on top of my pillow. I stared at them, then picked them up. My hand shook. I felt tension in my jaw and shoulders. I thought about leaving, but I had paid for the place. Also, I was curious. Nothing had hurt me so far. It was just unsettling. I decided to stay awake and watch what happened next. I sat on the bed with my back against the headboard. I kept the hallway light on. I listened. Hours passed. I heard soft taps in the corridor. I felt small breezes inside the room, like someone walking around. I saw shadows shift near the edges of the doorframe. Every time I tried to focus, they disappeared. I rubbed my eyes. I tried not to panic. Eventually, I got up and decided to explore the library again. I wanted to see if I could figure out what was happening. Maybe I could find something written down by the previous occupants. I headed downstairs carrying a small flashlight I found in my suitcase. It was weak, but better than nothing. I stepped into the library and turned on the overhead light again. I examined the shelves more carefully. Some books were just old volumes of encyclopedias. Others had personal notes inside. I flipped through pages, squinting. I found a thin journal tucked behind a thick hardback. The journal's first pages described the mansion's previous owner. He mentioned strange events after dark, unexplained footsteps, and disappearing objects. He wrote that no one ever spoke to him directly. He felt watched. He mentioned that he tried to communicate by leaving notes around. In response, objects moved to different rooms. He tried speaking aloud, asking questions. He never got a clear answer, but he noticed that certain rooms stayed quiet while others seemed active. He also wrote about the library whispering at night. He never understood what it was saying. I closed the journal and placed it on the desk. I felt relieved that I wasn't imagining things. The same presence had affected the previous owner. I tried what he said. I spoke out loud. "I know you're here. I don't know who you are. I don't want to fight. What do you want?" Silence followed. I waited. Then I saw movement at the far end of the library. I didn't panic this time. I held my flashlight steady. I said, "I'll leave something on the desk. Move it if you understand." I took a small pen from my pocket and placed it in the center of the desk. I stepped back, keeping the pen in sight. After a few moments, I saw it slide an inch to the left. I felt my stomach tighten, but I stood still. "Okay," I said. "You understand me. Do you want me to do something?" Move the pen once for yes, twice for no. The pen stayed still. "Can you show me something?" I asked. The pen rolled off the edge of the desk and fell to the floor. I flinched. My pulse raced. I bent down and picked up the pen. I looked at the shelves again. I noticed one shelf had several boxes and loose pages. I said, "Should I look there?" The pen slid out of my hand and fell onto the rug. I took that as a sign. I went to the shelf and checked the boxes. Inside one box was a stack of letters. The letters mentioned an old dispute about property boundaries. They mentioned someone who used to live here, who spent years trying to resolve legal problems. He wrote that he felt trapped. He wrote that he hoped someone in the future would understand. The letters were all signed with initials only. I stood there feeling the weight of the silence. I said, "Is this about the letters?" No answer. I left the letters out on the desk. I took the journal and placed it next to them. "I found these. I see what you left behind. Is that what you wanted?" Something knocked against the shelf. A book fell down. I picked it up. It had nothing written inside, just blank pages. I placed it back. "I'll keep these letters here on the desk. If you want them moved somewhere else, show me." I waited. The room felt heavy, but not hostile. I sat in the chair. My body felt tense, but I tried not to show fear. I listened. The whispers returned, softer now. They came from behind me. I stood up and turned around. Nothing there. I faced the desk again. The letters had shifted slightly. I aligned them neatly. I said, "Do you need me to fix something? Are you trying to have your story known?" Silence again. I was talking to an empty room and feeling foolish, but there was no one else to talk to. After a while, I left the library. I went back to the living room and found my keys on the table again, exactly where I had left them the first time. I checked the sofa cushions to confirm I hadn't missed them before. Nothing else was out of place. I looked around. My heart was still beating fast, but I didn't feel the same sharp panic. It felt like a strange understanding had passed between me and whatever moved the objects. I decided to sleep a bit. I went upstairs, turned on the bedroom light, and lay down. I kept my keys under my pillow this time. The bed felt a bit softer. The house was still old, still musty, still filled with strange noises. But now I knew I wasn't the first to experience this. I knew the presence understood me. It could move things, it could whisper, but it hadn't hurt me. It seemed to want attention or recognition. I didn't sleep well. I woke up many times, hearing the floor creak or the wind outside. Each time, I saw no one. Morning light came slowly through the cloudy windows. The fog remained outside, thick and unmoving. I checked the hallway. Everything looked normal. I went downstairs. The letters were still on the desk in the library. Nothing had changed overnight. I felt calmer in daylight. I made a decision to stay. I would keep the place in order, respect whatever lived here, and try not to provoke it. I spent the next hour tidying up. I dusted some shelves and wiped the kitchen counter. The presence didn't interfere. Sometimes I sensed movement in the corner of my eye, but when I turned, nothing was there. The whispers were gone. The objects stayed where I put them. I placed the letters in a drawer in the library, neatly stacked. I said out loud, "I'm putting these here. If you don't like it, move them." They never moved them again. The pen stayed in my pocket. It felt strange, living with something unseen that refused to speak clearly. But it didn't seem evil or violent. It felt more like a watchful observer. Maybe it had its own reasons. I had no way to know. I accepted that. At night, I kept a few lights on. I slept with the door unlocked. I still heard soft creaks and the occasional whisper, but I felt less afraid. I carried on like that for the next few days, settling into a routine. I tried to keep the place tidy and respectful. In return, the presence remained calm and distant. I never got a clear message. I never understood exactly what it wanted, other than maybe to be noticed. But it stopped moving my keys. It stopped knocking books off shelves. I sometimes caught sight of a vague shape in the halls, but it always vanished before I could look directly at it. The tension never left entirely. My neck and shoulders stayed tight when I walked through certain rooms. But I managed. I stayed, and the presence stayed too. Neither of us crossed a line. In the end, I learned to live with it. I never solved the mystery. I never needed to. The mansion belonged to it as much as it did to me. As long as I respected that, it kept its distance. I guess that was enough. I remember the day I arrived at that property. It was late afternoon and the sky looked clear. I had just inherited the place from a distant relative I barely knew. I had driven up in my old truck, parked near the front porch, and looked out at the wide fields and the old farmhouse. The paint on the house was chipped, and the wooden boards creaked under my boots. It smelled like old dirt and dried leaves. I remember feeling a slight chill despite the warm sun on my neck. I knew nothing about running a farm. I just wanted to look around, figure out what to do with it, and maybe sell it off. I was expecting empty rooms, dusty furniture, and some creaky floors. I was not expecting to find a secret door leading to some kind of underground library. I was not expecting to feel eyes on my back when I tried to read those old books under dim, flickering lamplight. I was not expecting to see a distorted face in the corner of a mirror, only to find no one there when I turned around. I started by walking through the house to get a sense of it. The front door opened into a hallway with a wooden floor covered in dirt and dead bugs. The walls had faded wallpaper peeling at the corners. I opened a couple of doors and found a small kitchen with a rusty sink and an empty pantry. I found a living room with dusty chairs, a coffee table, and a fireplace filled with old ash. I saw a bedroom that smelled like mold and had a mattress sagging in the middle. Each step kicked up dust. My nose itched. I coughed a bit and decided to open some windows. Most of them were stuck and I had to push hard. Fresh air helped. I didn't see anything strange at first. Just a run-down farmhouse with some old junk in closets and drawers. In the back of the house, I noticed a locked door under the stairs. It was small, just a wooden panel with a padlock. I thought it might be a storage space. The lock looked old. The key I had on my ring fit, and it clicked open easily. Inside, I saw a narrow set of steps going down. I shined my flashlight, saw stone walls, and smelled something stale. The air was heavier down there. I hesitated, but I was curious. I went down slowly. My boots scraped against the stone steps. The light from my flashlight bounced off the walls, showing me cracks and old cobwebs. The sound of my breathing felt louder. At the bottom, I reached a small room. The ceiling was low. I had to keep my head down a bit. There were shelves lining the walls, filled with old books. I saw a few oil lamps hanging from hooks in the stone. They had thick glass and old wicks. I tried one lamp. I found a small box of matches on a shelf near the stairway. The matches were dry enough to use, surprisingly. I lit one of the lamps. The flame flickered and cast a weak yellowish light. I lit 2 more lamps. I didn't trust the old wiring, and I saw no electric lights anyway. Now I could see the room clearly. The shelves were stacked with large, leather-bound books. They had thick spines with no readable titles. The books were covered in dust. There was a small wooden desk in the corner with a stool. On the desk, there was a pile of papers, some in envelopes, some tied with string. The room smelled like old paper and that stale odor I couldn't identify. My throat felt dry. My eyes watered a bit. I noticed a few mirrors built into some of the shelves, small and round, with frames that looked rusted. The mirrors were dull. Their surfaces were spotty, and I could barely see my reflection in them. I ran my hand along one of the shelves. Dust coated my fingers. I tried to read the spines on the books, but they had faded writing that made no sense to me. I took one book off the shelf and placed it on the desk. Its cover was thick and leathery. I opened it. The pages felt rough. I saw cramped handwriting and strange symbols. The language was not familiar. I could not tell if it was some old form of English or something else. I flipped through the pages, squinting. My flashlight was still in my hand, so I set it down on the desk. I heard the lamp flame crackle quietly. I listened to the silence. I could hear my own heartbeat. My hand started to tremble slightly. I didn't know why. The room was quiet. No sound except for my breathing and the faint hiss of the lamp's flame. Yet I felt as if someone stood behind me, leaning over my shoulder, watching the pages I turned. I glanced at the mirror on the shelf to my right. In the weak light, I thought I saw movement, like a shape passing behind me. I turned around. There was no one there, just shelves, stone walls, and dust. I felt a tightening in my chest. I held the book open and stared at the words. They meant nothing to me. They were just letters and symbols, ink faded to brown. Some lines looked like diagrams, but I couldn't be sure. I ran my finger along the text and felt bumps in the paper. My finger left a trail in the dust. I decided to try another book. Maybe there was something more understandable. I put the first book back on the shelf and took another one. This one was heavier. I struggled to get it off the shelf without dropping it. As I placed it on the desk and opened it, I noticed one of the mirrors again. This time, I saw a face in the reflection. It appeared for just a second. The face looked pale with features that were not clear. The eyes seemed too large, and the mouth looked twisted. I saw it blink. It happened fast, like a quick movement in the corner of my eye. I snapped my head around, and again there was nothing there. I stood up straight and felt sweat forming on my forehead. My heart rate picked up. I took a step back, then stepped forward again. I leaned in close to the mirror and looked. I only saw my own face, half covered in shadow. I looked tired and tense. My shirt collar was damp with sweat. I decided to move one of the lamps closer. I wanted more light. I lifted a lamp off its hook. It made a scraping sound as metal slid off metal. I brought it closer to the desk and set it down. The extra light made the mirrors show clearer reflections. I looked again. Now I only saw my own reflection and the shelves behind me. I thought maybe the flickering light and my own stress were causing me to see things. But my hands were still shaking. I tried reading the second book. The writing was similar, cramped symbols and odd marks. I turned a page. The paper stuck together at the edges. As I peeled the pages apart, I saw a detailed drawing. It looked like a diagram of a room, maybe a blueprint. I could recognize straight lines for walls and rows of shelves. I realized it might be a drawing of this exact room. I looked around. The number of shelves seemed to match. I saw a mark on the diagram that might represent a trap door or another hidden passage. I looked up at the ceiling and walls, trying to spot anything unusual. The ceiling was made of wooden beams. The walls were stone. Nothing stood out. I tapped the stones. They felt solid and cold. While I was inspecting the walls, I heard a quiet sound behind me. It was like a muffled shuffle, as if a foot had scraped the floor. I spun around. The room was empty except for me and the shelves. But I noticed something different. One of the mirrors seemed turned slightly to a new angle. I did not remember touching it. I stepped closer to it. The metal frame looked old and bent. Rust flaked off when I touched it. I tried to tilt it back. It resisted. I pulled a bit harder, and it made a creaking sound. I looked into the mirror and saw the back of my own head, the desk, and the lamplight. Then something flickered in the background of the reflection. It was that face again just behind my shoulder. It blinked and twisted its mouth. I dropped the mirror, and it hit the shelf with a dull sound. When I turned around, I saw nothing but empty air. I felt a jolt in my chest. I gasped. I backed away from the shelves and bumped into the desk. My elbow hit the edge. The pain was sharp and real. That anchored me. I tried to focus on my breathing. I wanted to leave, but I also wanted to understand what I was seeing. Was it a trick of the light? Was I imagining things? I touched my forehead and felt sweat. The air smelled musty and stale, mixed with the faint smell of burning lamp oil. I decided to pick up a different book and flip through it quickly, just to see if anything inside made sense. I grabbed a smaller book. Its cover felt rough, and it made my fingers itch. I opened it and saw rows of neat handwriting, maybe in some old language. As I turned the pages, I glanced up at the mirrors. I tried to keep them in my peripheral vision. I wanted to catch any movement. My hands shook as I turned pages. The paper made a dry, rustling sound. My throat felt tight. I swallowed hard. I saw something in the reflection again. This time it was a brief flash, as if the figure ducked down out of sight. I jerked my head up. Nothing was there. I felt a surge of anger mixed with fear. I did not like feeling cornered by something I couldn't see. I clenched my fist and stepped forward, trying to surprise whatever might be lurking. I moved quickly along the shelves, checking every corner. I looked under the desk. I looked behind some crates stacked in one corner. I found no one. The only sound was my breathing and the occasional crackle of the lamp flame. I walked back to the desk and closed the book. I stood still for a moment. My legs felt tense. My neck muscles were stiff. I wiped sweat from under my hairline with my sleeve. I looked at the stairs leading up. I could just leave. But I was curious. Who built this place? Why hide a library of strange books under a farmhouse? Why have these mirrors that reflected something that didn't seem to exist in the room? I decided to examine the mirrors more carefully. I found 3 of them in total. One was on the right wall near the desk. Another was on the far wall near a stack of books. The third was near the stairs. Each mirror was small and round. Each had rusted metal frames. The glass was a bit warped. When I stared into one, my reflection looked distorted. My forehead looked larger, and my eyes looked sunken. The lamplight made my skin look pale. I noticed that when I angled the lamp away, the reflection changed slightly. Shadows moved across the shelves. Dust particles floated in the beam of light. I could see small specks drifting in the air. I tried a test. I stood in front of one mirror and slowly reached my hand back behind me, feeling the empty air. I watched my reflection as I did this. My reflection did exactly what I did, just a normal reflection. Then I turned my head a bit. The corner of the mirror showed part of another shelf behind me. I fixed my gaze on that shelf in the reflection and waited. After a few long seconds, I saw a shape peek out from behind the corner of the shelf in the mirror. It looked like a head turning slightly, but I could not make out any details. It was just a pale, blurry shape. It moved so fast I almost doubted I had seen it. I turned around, and once again nothing was there. I felt a strong urge to get out of that room. My chest felt tight, my palms were sweaty. The air felt too still, too stale. I picked up my flashlight and backed away toward the stairs. As I moved away from the desk, I noticed that some of the books were slightly out of line, as if someone had touched them recently. I had no memory of doing that. I walked quickly to the bottom of the stairs, still holding the flashlight and one of the lamps. The stairs creaked as I placed my foot on the first step. I heard a quiet scrape behind me, like a book sliding on a shelf. I turned off the lamp and let the flashlight beam sweep the room. Books, shelves, desk, mirrors, dust, stone walls, nothing else. My heart pounded. I climbed the steps, holding the flashlight tight. When I reached the door at the top, I turned back one last time. The lamplight I had left behind flickered on the wall. In the edge of the light, I thought I saw a face leaning out from behind a shelf, watching me go. The face was pale and twisted, and it blinked once. I did not say anything. I just closed the door. Back in the hallway, I locked the door under the stairs. My hand shook as I turned the key. I leaned against the wall and tried to slow my breathing. My shirt was damp, and my mouth felt dry. I wiped my face with both hands and stood there for a moment. The hallway smelled dusty, but at least it felt open and normal. I moved to the living room and sat down on a chair. The cushions sent up a puff of dust. I coughed. Outside, I heard a distant rustling of wind in the trees. That sound felt normal, comforting even. I stayed in that chair for a long time. I looked around and saw nothing unusual. Just an old farmhouse with old furniture. Eventually, I got up and went out to the porch. The sun was lower now and the sky had turned orange and pink. I stood there, breathing fresh air, trying to clear my head. I thought about the books, the mirrors, and that face blinking at me. I had no explanation. I just knew I did not want to go back down there. I wanted to keep the door locked and maybe find a way to move on from this place. I had inherited it, but I was not prepared for whatever was hidden below. I felt that tightness in my chest loosening a bit as I looked at the open sky. I told myself I would never return to that secret room. I told myself I would leave those books and that twisted reflection alone. I stood there until the light faded. I didn't have any plans yet, but I knew I would not spend the night here. I would go back to my truck and sleep there if I had to. I would leave that strange library and its silent watcher behind that locked door. I would not think about it if I could help it. The fresh air felt good. My heartbeat slowly returned to normal. I rubbed my hands on my jeans and tried to steady myself. I was relieved to be out of that room, but I could still feel that presence. I tried to ignore it. I tried to focus on what I could see and what I could feel right here on the porch in the open air. I went up there that night because I heard footsteps. They sounded like slow, steady steps on old boards. I knew my attic was empty. I never stored much up there. Still, I couldn't ignore the noise. I grabbed a flashlight and a small hammer, something I picked up at random from the kitchen drawer. I didn't want to head up unarmed. When I got up into that cramped space, I found a triangular window I'd never paid attention to before. Its glass was cracked. On the other side, there was a figure, pale and silent. I stopped breathing right then and there. I just stood and stared at that face through the cracked glass, feeling my stomach tighten and my heartbeat push against my ears. I held the flashlight against my chest and stood near the opening to the attic. It was dark, dust in the air, and the smell of old wood made me cough. I could still feel the chill from outside creeping through that cracked window. I remember the boards under my feet creaking as I took a step forward. There were no lights on up there, just the faint beam from my flashlight, which flickered sometimes because the batteries were not fresh. I took a few more steps, moving slowly. My shoes scraped on the dusty floor. My throat felt dry. I swallowed hard and tried not to make noise. I was sweating. I could feel sweat trickling down my neck, and my fingers trembled a bit around the flashlight's handle. I reached the far side of the attic and stood right under that strange triangular window. The glass looked thin and dirty. There was a jagged crack running across it. I noticed small flecks of dust and maybe bits of paint peeling off the wooden frame. Outside was dark, but there was enough light from a distant street lamp to show me the outline of a pale face pressed close to the glass. I couldn't see its details clearly, but I saw the pale skin. No one moved. I lifted my flashlight and shined it at the window. The figure didn't move away. It stayed right there, staring back at me. My heart was pounding hard. I felt my chest tighten, and my breathing came in quick, shallow bursts. I couldn't understand what I was looking at. I tried speaking, but no words came out at first. Eventually, I managed to force out a weak, "Hey, what do you want?" No answer. I heard no breathing. I heard no tapping. Just silence, and that face close to the glass. I didn't know who it could be. I thought maybe someone climbed onto my roof. Maybe someone was playing a trick on me. I stepped closer, my hammer raised in my other hand. I could see now that the figure's eyes looked dark, maybe black. The skin was almost white, and I saw no hair. There were no features that stood out, just this pale face and those dark eyes. I felt the muscles in my legs tighten, ready to run if I had to. I tried again to speak. "Can you hear me?" Nothing. No response, no nod, no shaking of the head, just silence. The cracked glass was maybe an inch from that face. I didn't know if the glass would hold if the figure pushed. My hand holding the hammer felt sweaty. I adjusted my grip and thought about what would happen if the window broke. I moved the beam of the flashlight around the attic, looking for something to block the window. I found an old wooden trunk. It looked heavy, covered in dust. I dragged it across the floor, making a loud scraping noise. The figure remained at the window, watching. I felt the hair on my arms stand up as I worked. I lifted the trunk and placed it under the window. I hoped it would reinforce things if the figure tried to push through. I stood on the trunk, got closer to the glass. My face was maybe 2 feet away from that pale head. I tried tapping the glass gently with the handle of the hammer. I wanted to see if I'd get a reaction. Nothing. I tapped harder. Nothing. Then the figure raised a hand and pressed it against the glass. I heard the glass creak. I jerked back, almost losing my balance on the trunk. I jumped down and stood behind the trunk, breathing hard. I wiped sweat from my face with my sleeve. My mouth felt dry. I tried to swallow. The attic was quiet, except for my breathing. I pulled out my phone and checked the signal. Almost nothing. I tried making a call to the police. The call didn't go through. I tried sending a text. It failed. I cursed under my breath. I shouted, "I'm calling the police." The figure didn't move. I looked around and found some old metal rods and a piece of rope. I tried reinforcing the window frame. My hands shook as I worked. I tied the rods across the frame, hoping to prevent the window from opening. The figure watched. I saw the faint reflection of my flashlight's beam on its pale face. I didn't hear it breathe or move. I finished tying the rope, hands clumsy and slow. I checked the attic door behind me, the one that led back to my hallway. It had swung closed. I tried opening it. It felt stuck. I pulled harder. It wouldn't budge. I kicked it, but it only rattled. I could feel panic rising in my chest. I didn't want to be stuck up there with that thing at the window. I pulled again, feeling sweat roll down my temples. The door finally gave a little. I shoved my shoulder into it. It creaked and opened a crack. I could see my hallway light below. Before I left, I looked back at the window. The figure was still there, palm against the cracked glass. The crack spread a little more. A tiny shard fell inside. It landed on the floor. I watched it as if it were something dangerous. I wanted to leave, but I also didn't want that figure to break in once I was gone. I tried pushing the trunk closer to the window. I shoved a plank of wood in front of it. I pressed my shoulder against the trunk and felt the rough wood against my shirt. I tried to wedge the plank under the frame. The figure pressed harder. The glass groaned. I backed away. My voice came out shaky. "Just go away," I said. It didn't react. I didn't know what else to do. I turned and forced the attic door open wider, placing my foot on the top stair. I held the flashlight in one hand and the hammer in the other. I considered taking one more look to be sure it wasn't just my imagination. I turned and aimed the flashlight at the window. The figure's eyes met mine, dark and unwavering. I felt a surge of adrenaline. I hurried down the stairs, each step creaking loudly. My breath was rapid and shallow. My legs felt weak and my hand gripped the railing so hard my knuckles hurt. I reached the hallway and pushed the attic door closed behind me. There was no proper lock on it, just a latch. I slid the latch in place and pressed my ear against the door. I listened. No sound, no footsteps. I couldn't tell if the figure was still there. I moved away from the attic door, keeping my eyes on it. I took out my phone again and tried calling the police. This time I moved around the hallway, hoping for a better signal. After a few attempts, I got through. I told them someone was at my attic window refusing to leave. I kept it simple. I said I felt threatened. They said they'd send someone. I walked down the stairs to my living room and turned on a lamp. The soft light felt safer than the darkness upstairs. I tried to calm down. I noticed my hands were shaking. I placed the hammer on the coffee table and waited. I could hear my own breathing slow down a bit. I checked the front door to make sure it was locked. I peered out a window in the living room. The street looked empty and quiet. After some minutes, I heard a knock at the door. I jumped at the sound. It was the police. 2 officers. They came inside, flashlights in hand. I led them upstairs to the attic door. My voice sounded uneven as I explained what happened. They opened the attic door, shining their flashlights around. I followed them a few steps behind. We reached the attic again. The trunk was still there, the rods and rope still in place. The window was cracked, a few shards missing. Dust was still in the air. The officers moved boxes and old junk around, checking every corner. They opened the window and looked outside. They didn't see anyone. One of them leaned out carefully, shining the flashlight along the roof. He didn't find a ladder or any marks. He said maybe someone climbed down already. I stood there, arms folded, rubbing my forehead, feeling embarrassed and frustrated. I insisted that I saw someone. I told them about the pale face, the hand pressed against the glass. They just nodded and said they believed me, but they couldn't find anyone now. They told me to keep an eye out and maybe board up the window until I can get it fixed. They suggested I call them if it happens again. They seemed calm, as if it wasn't a big deal. They left after a few minutes. I walked them to the door, thanked them, and locked it behind them. I stood in the hallway with the lights on, listening to their car drive away. Then I went back to the living room and sat down. I picked up the hammer and held it in my lap. My heart was still beating faster than normal. My throat still felt dry. I thought about going back to bed, but I didn't want to sleep upstairs. I stayed downstairs, turning on a few lights to feel safer. I checked my phone again. The signal was fine now. I guess it was just weak in the attic. I considered calling someone I knew, but it was late. I didn't want to bother anyone. I decided to wait until morning to deal with the window. I listened to the quiet house. I heard the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a neighbor's dog barking at something. I waited, half expecting to hear footsteps above me again. I heard nothing. Hours passed. I checked the front door again, looked out the window onto the street. Still nothing unusual. I sat there in the living room chair, hammer in hand, until the first light of morning came through the windows. My neck was stiff, and my shoulders ached. My legs felt heavy. I stood up and stretched. I looked at the attic door from the bottom of the stairs. It stayed closed. I didn't hear a single sound from it. Eventually, I decided to go up in daylight. I took the hammer again and climbed the stairs. I opened the attic door slowly. The room looked ordinary. Dust in the air, boxes against the walls, the trunk under the window. The window was still cracked. The floor had small shards of glass near the frame. The rods and rope were still in place. The figure was gone. I saw nothing outside but the neighbor's roof and the morning sky. No footprints, no signs of anyone standing on the ledge. I sighed and lowered my hammer. I went back downstairs and called a window repair service. I decided not to tell them about the figure. I just said I needed the window replaced. They said they'd come in a few days. Until then, I would avoid the attic at night. I never figured out what that figure was. I know what I saw. It was right there, silent and unmoving, staring through the cracked glass. I don't have any explanations. All I know is that it didn't say a word. It didn't try to break in. It just stood there, close enough that I could have touched it if not for the glass. I don't like thinking about it. I can still remember how my heart pounded and how my chest felt tight. I remember the way my hands shook when I tried to tie the rods to the frame, the way I couldn't get a signal on my phone at first, the way the figure pressed that hand against the glass and made it crack a bit more. Since that night, I sleep downstairs. I keep my phone charged and a hammer by my side. I still hear the old boards creak sometimes, but I'm never sure if it's just the house settling or something else. If I ever hear footsteps again, I'm not sure what I'll do. For now, I'm just glad I got out of that attic and that I didn't stay there any longer with that silent, pale figure staring back at me. I moved into that apartment because I wanted to be left alone. The place looked normal enough at first glance. It was on the top floor of an old building that had been empty for a long time. I found it in a classified ad. The rent was cheap, and no one bothered me when I asked to see it. The agent left the key in an envelope and never showed up in person. I took that as a good sign. I didn't want anyone around, and I didn't need explanations. I just grabbed the key, climbed the stairs, and walked in. The stairwell was dark. The walls were stained, and there was a musty smell. My shoes scraped over layers of dust that had settled everywhere. When I reached the top floor and pushed open the apartment door, the hinges squeaked loudly. Inside, it was quiet. There were a few pieces of old furniture left behind. A sofa with faded fabric, a kitchen table with uneven legs, and a bed frame in the bedroom. The windows were dirty, the paint on the walls chipped, and there was rust along the edges of the metal door frames. I noticed the smell of something stale in the air, like damp concrete or old plumbing. But I didn't care. I wanted to be alone. The first night I tried to get settled. I opened a window to get some air, but the window stuck. I had to push harder. It finally creaked open. but the frame felt weak and gritty. I left it open for a while and unpacked my suitcase. I had a few clothes, some basic food, my phone, and a flashlight. I planned to buy supplies the next day. I locked the door from inside and tested the light switches. The bulbs flickered but stayed on. The pipes made knocking sounds when I ran the water. I found it annoying but not surprising. The place was old. I didn't sleep well. There were voices in the distance. They sounded like they were coming from another room, but I checked every door, and each room was empty. I heard low murmurs like people arguing in hushed tones. I put my ear to the wall, but I couldn't make out words. I walked into the living room, stood still, and listened. The voices kept going. I searched the apartment, opening every cabinet and closet, but found nothing. The rooms were bare. Dust swirled around my ankles when I moved. After a while, I gave up and tried to sleep on the mattress. It smelled damp, and the fabric was rough against my skin. In the morning, I woke up feeling sore. My neck was stiff. I noticed that the metal around the windows and doors had more rust than before. The hinges looked corroded. I remembered them being only a bit rusty the previous day. I touched the metal frame of the kitchen window. Rust flakes crumbled under my fingertips. It didn't make sense that it had spread so fast overnight. I tried not to think about it. I decided to go out and buy some groceries, but before I left, I noticed something else strange. The bathroom mirror was fogged up. I hadn't used hot water, and the apartment was cold. I wiped the mirror with my hand. The fog cleared for a moment, and I thought I saw shapes moving in the reflection. They were faint, almost like silhouettes behind frosted glass. I leaned closer. The glass was cold, and my breath felt shaky. I pressed my hand against it. Nothing. The shapes vanished when I blinked. I stood there a moment longer, then turned away and left the apartment. I came back later with supplies. More food, a few tools, tape, and extra light bulbs. I planned to fix some things. I also brought cleaning supplies. I wanted to at least wipe the dust off the furniture. When I stepped inside, I felt a chill. The smell of damp walls and rusty metal was stronger. I closed the door, and the latch felt stiff. I checked it and saw fresh rust. It scraped at my fingernail when I tried to pick it off. I brought the groceries into the kitchen and opened the fridge. It was empty and smelled stale. I left the food on the table. As I unpacked, I heard those voices again. They sounded like they were in the next room. I followed the sound into what looked like a small storage room. There was nothing inside but dust and a couple of cracked floor tiles. The voices were muffled, tense. I said, "Hello?" They didn't answer. I heard low murmurs. I paced around the room, leaning close to each wall. The sound didn't grow clearer. It just hovered, always somewhere else. I left and tried to ignore it. I wanted to clean the bathroom mirror. It bothered me. I took a cloth and tried to wipe it. The moment I touched it, the mirror fogged up again, and behind the layer of mist, I saw those silhouettes moving. They seemed to raise their hands, pressing them against something. I wiped harder, but the fog returned instantly. I stepped back. My stomach felt tense. I tried breathing slowly. I decided to cover the mirror. I taped a piece of cloth over it, but after a few minutes, the cloth felt damp and began to slip. I gave up and left it uncovered. I decided I just wouldn't look at it. Over the next few hours, the apartment felt strange. The rust kept appearing on the door handles and window frames. It grew thicker and flaked onto the floor. I swept it up, but more appeared. The voices in the empty room never stopped. Sometimes they got quieter, sometimes louder, but always the same low, angry muttering. I tried turning on music on my phone to block it out, but I had no signal. The phone showed no bars. I tried calling someone. The call didn't connect. Later, I tried to open the window to get some fresh air. The window was stuck. The handle wouldn't turn. I tried forcing it, but the metal bent and snapped. I tried another window. The same thing happened. I tried the door. The knob turned, but the door wouldn't open. I pulled hard. It felt like the frame had shifted. I yanked at it, grunting, but it didn't budge. I checked the hinges. They were covered in rust and the metal looked warped. I tried pushing with my shoulder. Nothing. It wasn't locked from the outside, just stuck. I couldn't leave. My heart began to race. I felt sweat on my forehead. The smell of the apartment got worse, like metal shavings and rotten wood. I turned on all the lights. The bulbs flickered but stayed lit. I listened for any sound from outside. Nothing. I tapped on the walls. I shouted for help. No response. The apartment was silent except for those distant voices. They never responded to me. I looked at my phone again. No signal. I tried opening a kitchen drawer, hoping to find tools. I found a few old utensils, a bent fork, a dull knife. Nothing that could help me pry the door open. I tried using the knife to scrape away rust from the door frame. The blade bent. I tried kicking the door. It hurt my foot. I tried prying at the window with the fork. The metal squealed, but didn't move. I went to the bathroom and turned on the faucet. The water ran cold. The mirror fogged up without any reason. I watched the silhouettes. They moved slowly, like people trapped behind glass. I tried talking to them. No response. I tried tapping the mirror. The surface felt normal, just glass. I tried running the water hot, but there was no hot water. Still, the mirror stayed foggy. My chest felt tight. I left the bathroom and tried sitting on the sofa. The springs poked at my back. I tried to ignore the voices. They kept going, always the same tone. It was never loud enough to make out words, just the sound of arguments that never ended. I got up and walked to that empty room again. It was silent when I stepped inside, as if the voices moved elsewhere whenever I entered. I stood still, waiting. Nothing. When I left, they started again. I tried blocking the bathroom mirror with newspapers. The tape wouldn't hold. The paper got damp and fell down. I pushed the sofa against the front door and tried ramming it. The door didn't move. Rust flakes rained down. I covered my mouth to avoid breathing them in. I could taste metal on my tongue. I turned off the lights to see if it made a difference. In the dark, the voices sounded closer and I heard soft creaks in the floorboards. I turned the lights back on. Nothing there. I checked my watch. Time passed, but slowly. I tried to sleep. The bed was damp and smelled bad. I lay there, staring at the ceiling. The paint had cracks and some flakes fell onto my face. I spit them out and rubbed my eyes. The voices grew louder. I got up, clenched my fists and yelled, "Stop!" They paused for a few seconds, then continued. My throat felt dry. I tried drinking tap water. It tasted stale. I drank it anyway. I tried to break the window with a chair. I swung it at the glass. The impact was dull. The glass didn't even crack. I tried again. The chair legs rattled, but the window stayed intact. I picked up my phone and tried again for a signal. Still nothing. I paced around. The apartment was cramped. Every surface felt damp or rough. I tried the door again. No movement. I tried calling the landlord with the apartment's phone line. It just crackled. I said, "Hello? I need help." Silence. I tapped the hook. Static and nothing else. I walked into the kitchen and checked the cabinets. Empty. I opened the fridge. Still empty except for the smell. I took a snack I had brought and tried to eat it. It tasted stale, but I forced it down. My stomach felt uneasy. I tried again to find a way out, pushing at the windows, looking for any gap. Everything was sealed. The building felt like a sealed box. I searched the hallway outside the apartment. The hallway was dark and dusty. The other apartment doors looked old and locked. I tried a door across the hall. The knob wouldn't turn. I tried the stairwell. The door to the stairs was stuck, just like my apartment door. I tried forcing it. The hinges were coated in thick rust. I pushed until my arms shook. No luck. Back inside, the voices wouldn't stop and the mirror silhouettes appeared whenever I was in the bathroom. I tried to ignore them. I stood by the window and waited for sunrise. It took a long time. I watched the faint lights outside. The street was empty. I saw no one. I tapped on the glass, hoping someone outside might notice. No one did. The air felt heavy. I could feel my heart pounding. I rubbed my arms to keep warm. My clothes felt damp and smelled musty. Dust clung to my hair. Every time I touched the metal surfaces, rust came off under my fingernails. The voices kept up their low arguments. The silhouettes shifted around, sometimes pressing their faces close to the glass, sometimes leaning back. I tried to focus on basic actions to keep calm. I rearranged my belongings. I wiped the floors. The dust just spread around. I tried to wash my face again. The water was always cold. My face felt numb. I dried it off with a towel that smelled like old fabric. I sat on the sofa and listened to the building. I could hear faint creaks and pops from the walls. I tapped my foot on the floor. The sound felt hollow, but I couldn't find a weak spot. I tried everything I could think of, but nothing changed. The windows stayed shut. The door stayed jammed. The voices kept arguing, and the mirror showed those silhouettes. I felt sweat trickle down my back. My muscles were tense. My head ached from the smell of rust and damp walls. I didn't know how long I would be stuck here. I tried to shout again for help, but my voice just echoed in the empty rooms. There was no way out. I tried to wait, hoping something would shift. But the night dragged on. The voices never stopped, and I remained there, trapped, with nothing to do but wait and hope something would change. I remember it was around 3 in the morning. The sky was covered in thick gray clouds and the wind felt wet against my face. I had just finished my usual walk through the outskirts of my village. I was on my way back, flashlight in hand, when I passed the old stone bridge. Everyone in town called it the old one because it had been there longer than anyone alive. I never paid it much attention before, but that night was different. I heard something. It came from the area below the bridge. It sounded like whispers or someone talking in a low voice. It was faint, but the tone had a strange quality, like a muffled chant or a string of words that made no sense. I slowed down. The ground was damp from recent rain. My boots left wet marks on the mossy stones. I leaned over the side of the bridge and aimed my flashlight down. The beams hit the dark shape of a small cave opening just under the bridge's side, where the earth had eroded over time. Inside, I saw the faint reflection of water. The murmurs rose again, still unclear, a soft, continuous hum. I didn't see anyone, but the sound kept coming. I shifted my weight from one foot to the other. My legs felt a bit shaky, and I tightened my grip on the flashlight. I told myself it might be a trick of the wind passing through cracks in the rock, or maybe some small animal, but it didn't sound like an animal. It sounded like something with a voice, though not one I could understand. My heart was beating harder than usual, and the air felt heavier. I decided to go down. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I was curious. Maybe I wanted to be sure nothing strange was going on near the village. I stepped off the side of the path and moved slowly down the muddy slope. The mud clung to my boots and I slipped once, catching myself with my free hand on a wet rock. The smell under the bridge was stale, like standing water and old leaves. I flicked the beam of the flashlight around, checking the ground for anything that could trip me. There were slippery stones and patches of moss everywhere. The darkness down there was thick, and the only light I had was the narrow beam from my flashlight. As I reached the cave opening, I noticed the water inside was shallow, only a few inches deep, and it flowed slowly toward the small creek beyond. The cave wasn't large, but it seemed deeper than I expected. The ceiling was low. I could stand, but had to bend my neck a bit. The sound was clearer now. It still sounded like murmurs, a series of low voices blending together, but there was no one there. I saw no figures, no animals, nothing. Just the sound. I took a step forward. My flashlight caught something on the wall. The rocks were wet, glistening with moisture. On them were strange symbols drawn with something that gave off a dull glow. They were not bright like neon signs, but they emitted a soft, greenish light. The shapes were not letters I recognized. They were twisting lines and curved shapes that overlapped each other. Some looked almost like long spirals and others like knotted loops. I reached out with my free hand and touched the wall. It felt cold and slick, and the glowing marks seemed to be made of some kind of slimy, thin substance. When I pulled my hand back, nothing came off on my fingers. The symbols stayed lit, pulsing a bit, as if they reacted to my touch. I frowned and took another step deeper inside. The ground squished under my boots. The air was even staler inside, and there was a slight vibration. It felt like a low hum you could feel inside your ears. I whispered, "Hello?" I don't know what I expected. Maybe a person hiding in the back, maybe some prankster, but there was no response. The murmuring continued, constant, without pause, but I couldn't pinpoint where it came from. It seemed to come from all around, bouncing off the wet stone walls. I was sweating a little now. My heart felt tight and my breathing turned shallow. I could smell my own sweat mixing with the stale cave odor. I moved the flashlight beam around, trying to see how far the cave went. About 10 or 15 feet ahead, the tunnel bent to the left. Water trickled from the ceiling, dripping rhythmically into the shallow pool at my feet. The sound of dripping water joined the murmuring voices. The atmosphere felt cramped, as if the walls were leaning inward. I wanted to leave, but I also wanted to see what was around that bend. I felt uneasy, but I kept going. Each step made a soft splash. My flashlight beam trembled because my hand shook. I clenched my jaw to steady myself. My stomach felt tight. The murmurs stayed at the same volume, never rising or falling, never changing their tone. It was like an endless loop of low chatter. Then I heard another sound. It came from ahead, behind that bend. It wasn't voices. It was a wet, squishing noise like something moving through thick mud. It stopped for a moment, then started again. My mouth went dry. I raised the flashlight a bit higher. I wanted to see something, anything. The glow from the symbols was weaker there. The walls looked plain, just damp stone. The ceiling was a bit lower, forcing me to hunch my shoulders. My boots slipped a little on the slick ground. I reached the bend and leaned forward. The squishing noise stopped. The murmuring continued. I turned the corner and saw more glowing symbols. These looked more complex, with tighter loops and swirling shapes packed together. The glow was slightly brighter here. I scanned the floor and ceiling. The floor was covered in a thin layer of cloudy water. Bits of moss and small rocks floated on the surface. I saw no footprints or any sign of someone standing there. The cave ended a few steps ahead. A wall of stone blocked any further progress. I walked closer to the end. There was no place for anyone to hide. The cave simply stopped. The murmuring sound continued, but I still saw no source. I felt something in the air. It was like a light pressure on my chest. My breathing got shallow and I noticed a slight ringing in my ears. I aimed the flashlight at the symbols on the wall and stepped right up to them. The glow made it possible to see without the flashlight, but I kept it on anyway. I listened. The murmuring never stopped. It sounded closer now, as if just behind the wall. I leaned my ear against the stone. It was cold. The murmurs vibrated through the rock, a constant vibration. I pulled back. Then I heard that wet, squishing noise again, but this time it sounded like it was coming from somewhere behind me. I spun around quickly and aimed my flashlight into the darkness. Nothing. I saw only the uneven floor, the glowing symbols, and the water droplets falling from the ceiling. My heart pounded. My throat felt tight. I tried to stay calm. I told myself I was just hearing echoes. I took a deep breath. The air tasted stale. I could smell the damp stone and something else, something slightly sour. I took a step back toward the entrance. The wet noise came again, this time softer, but somehow closer. My palms were sweating. I tightened my grip on the flashlight. I didn't want to run and slip, but I wanted to get out of that cave. I moved slowly, careful with each step. The murmuring continued, unchanged, a steady drone that made no sense. As I approached the bend, I noticed something about the water on the floor. Tiny ripples moved across the surface even though I was standing still. The water vibrated slightly. I bent down and pointed the flashlight at the shallow layer. I could see small bubbles rising from beneath the stones, popping quietly. Something was agitating the water. I swallowed hard and took a few more steps. I tried not to breathe too loud. My heartbeat thumped in my head. I rounded the bend and aimed the flashlight toward the entrance of the cave. I could see the faint outline of the outside, a slightly lighter darkness. I felt relieved that it wasn't far. Then I heard something move behind me again. It was a soft scrape, like something dragging across stone. I froze. I listened. It stopped. The murmurs continued. My arms felt weak. My legs trembled. I took another step toward the exit and heard the dragging sound again. It sounded wet, heavy, like a thick rope being pulled through mud. I turned my head slowly and aimed the flashlight behind me. The walls and water reflected the beam. I saw nothing moving. The symbols glowed steadily. The cave was empty, but the sound had been there. My body tensed. The hair on my neck stood on end. I forced myself to move forward again, trying not to slip. The exit was maybe 10 steps away. I could see the faint glow of my flashlight hitting the outside stones. I took another step. Then I heard a dull splash just behind me. I spun around and pointed the flashlight at the spot where I had just been standing. For a split second, I caught a glimpse of a ripple in the water. It looked as if something had dipped into it and pulled back. I saw nothing above the surface. But the ripple spread out slowly. My breathing got faster. I felt a slight sting in my eyes from sweat trickling down my forehead. I didn't want to look away, but I had to get out. I backed up, keeping the flashlight pointed at that spot. Each step made a small splash, and with each splash, I expected to hear something lunging at me from the darkness. The murmuring stayed steady. I reached the mouth of the cave and stepped outside. The fresh air hit my face. I tasted relief. I climbed the muddy slope, slipping once more and scraping my knee on a rock. I cursed under my breath and kept moving. When I reached the top, I turned around and pointed the flashlight down at the cave entrance. From up there, I could see nothing but darkness. The murmuring was very faint now, almost impossible to hear over the wind. I stood there, breathing hard, my chest rising and falling quickly. My hands shook so much that the flashlight beam trembled across the ground. I waited, watching the entrance, expecting something to crawl out. Nothing happened. No shape emerged. No voice spoke. The night air was quiet except for the distant sound of leaves rustling. My clothes felt damp and heavy. I walked away from the bridge, my boots squishing on the wet ground. After a few steps, I turned the flashlight off to see if I could notice any glow coming from under the bridge. The bridge stood quiet and dark. No lights, no signs, just old stones. I turned the flashlight back on and moved further away. My muscles felt sore from the tension. I wanted to sit down, but I didn't want to stay near the place. I kept looking over my shoulder as I walked along the path toward the village. The wind felt cold on my sweaty neck. I tried to calm down, to focus on putting one foot in front of the other. Every time I blinked, I imagined those glowing symbols and that strange murmuring inside my head. It felt like I had left something unfinished, like I had stumbled onto something I should never have seen. But there was nothing else I could do. The cave was empty of any visible creatures, yet I could not explain the noises or the symbols. The sound of that wet movement was stuck in my mind. It had no source that I could see. The water ripples, the strange glow, the muffled whispers, none of it made sense. I had no reason to stay. I walked until I reached a fence post near an old tree, about 100 yards away from the bridge. I leaned on it and caught my breath. The air smelled like wet grass and bark. My knee throbbed where I scraped it. I felt the sting of the cut, and when I rolled up my pant leg to check, I could see a small scratch with a bead of blood. I wiped it clean with my hand, rubbed it dry on my pants, and kept going. The village lights were still far off. Most people were asleep at that hour. I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep easily after this. My stomach felt sour. I imagined those strange symbols and wondered if they were still glowing. They probably were. The memory of that cave and the murmurs would stick with me. As I walked, I stayed alert. I listened carefully for any hint of that strange sound following me. I heard only normal nighttime noises: wind, distant insects, the slight rustle of leaves. My boots made soft thuds on the damp ground. I cleared my throat, tried to get rid of the stale taste in my mouth. I was tired, but too wound up to relax. By the time I reached the outskirts of the village, I realized I had been holding the flashlight so tight my knuckles felt stiff. I loosened my grip, turned it off, and just stood there in the dark for a moment. The sky was still covered in clouds. I could feel the moisture in the air. Behind me, the direction of the bridge was just a patch of darkness. I saw no movement. I took a deep breath and forced myself to move forward. I would go home, lock my door, and sit in a chair until my heartbeat slowed down. I wanted to clean my boots and wash my hands. I still felt the cold, slimy sensation from touching those symbols. The memory made my skin crawl. I didn't know what was in that cave or what made those noises. I only knew it was not something I wanted to face again. I had seen no actual creatures, but I knew something was there. The presence was too strong to ignore. I would never look at that old stone bridge the same way again. The cave under it was no ordinary place. I would remember that night whenever I passed by. I would remember the murmuring, the strange glow, and the wet sounds in the dark. And I would stay away. I pulled my car into the parking lot of the motel a little after 10 at night. It looked like every other cheap roadside place I had ever seen. A single neon sign glowed by the entrance. The lot was about half full. I saw maybe 4 or 5 cars. The office door was propped open with a wooden wedge, and there was a bright light inside, so I headed in. The guy at the desk was an older man in a brown t-shirt. He didn't smile, just asked for my ID and credit card. I gave it to him. He typed my info, handed me a key, and pointed down the hall. Room 16. The hallway smelled like stale carpet and cleaning fluid. The door to my room stuck a little, so I had to shove it hard with my shoulder. Inside, there was a small TV on a dresser, a queen bed with a thin comforter, a small bathroom to the left, and a single lamp on the bedside table. The air felt a bit humid, but I was too tired to care. I just needed to sleep. I locked the door, threw my backpack on a chair, took off my shoes, and lay down. I didn't bother turning on the TV. I just wanted rest before driving again in the morning. I'm not sure how long I slept. Maybe a couple hours. Something woke me. It wasn't loud, but it was enough. I opened my eyes, feeling a slight headache from not sleeping well. The first thing I noticed was a kind of whispering sound. I thought maybe it was coming from outside the window, but when I looked over, the window was shut. I could hear the air conditioner humming quietly next to the bathroom door. The whispering didn't seem to come from outside. It was too faint, but definitely inside the room. I sat up in bed. I listened carefully. It sounded like a person talking, but not at a normal volume. It was more like a muffled voice coming through a wall. I got up and pressed my ear against the wall near the headboard. Nothing. I moved around the room, trying to find a spot where the whisper got louder. When I leaned down near the electrical outlet under the dresser, I heard it more clearly. It was a voice, very calm, talking about something I couldn't fully understand. I pulled the dresser a little to the side. The outlet was behind it. I put my face close. The voice was coming from there. It was speaking English, but I didn't recognize the words as anything meaningful. Something about a woman wearing a green coat, someone else in a restaurant's back room, a man in a hallway holding a stack of folders. It made no sense. It was like a string of random details. The voice was low, almost a whisper, but steady, as if it was reading from a script. I took a step back and tried the other outlets in the room. The same voice came from every one of them. I checked the one by the bed, one near the bathroom mirror, and even behind the TV. They all whispered the same bizarre things. I stood in the middle of the room, breathing hard. My chest felt tight. I tried to stay calm. I thought it might be some kind of trick, maybe a hidden speaker or a prank someone was playing on the guests. I walked over to the bedside lamp and unplugged it. The whispering continued. I checked the smoke alarm on the ceiling, pressed the test button. It beeped, but then went silent. The whispering never stopped. I couldn't understand why this was happening. I pressed my palms against the walls, tried to listen for any wires or devices. The walls felt solid. I tried flicking the light switch on and off a few times. Nothing changed. The voice kept talking, describing things like a hallway with green tiles, a man digging through a filing cabinet, a woman looking at herself in a mirror under fluorescent lights. I didn't know these people. I didn't know these places. The voice mentioned names I didn't recognize. It never mentioned me, never referred to the motel room, never acknowledged my presence at all. My mouth felt dry. I needed water. I turned on the bathroom light, opened the faucet, and splashed some water on my face. I drank a few sips from my hand. The voice was still there, coming through the outlets, echoing inside the wiring. I leaned out of the bathroom and stared at the outlets again. I tried covering one with my palm. I could still hear it, just slightly muffled. It was like the building's entire electrical system was carrying this voice straight into my room. I decided to call the front desk. The phone was on the bedside table. I picked it up, but there was no dial tone. I pressed the buttons. Nothing. I hung up and tried again. Still nothing. I realized the whispering might be affecting the phone line too, or maybe the phone was just broken. I put my shoes on and went outside into the hallway. The night air from the front door at the end of the hall was cool. The corridor was empty. The front desk was just around the corner. I looked for the man who checked me in, but he wasn't there. The desk was empty, lights still on, but nobody around. I said, "Hello?" Once. No answer. I waited, tapped the desk with my knuckle. Nothing. I walked back to my room, thinking maybe I should just pack up and leave. But I was tired, and I had already paid. I told myself maybe I could just ignore it, fall asleep with the TV on. I closed the door and turned on the TV. The volume worked fine, and a late-night show filled the room with normal voices. I turned it up until I could barely hear the whisper. I lay back down, tried to relax, tried to focus on the show. Some comedian was telling jokes to a small audience. I watched it for a while. Maybe 10 minutes passed before I felt my eyelids getting heavy again. I woke up to static on the TV. No show, just black and white noise. The volume was still high. I fumbled for the remote and muted it. The whispering was still there, unchanged, still describing scenes involving people I didn't know. I sat up, my heart beating faster. It hadn't stopped. I got up and turned off the TV. Then I decided to try something else. I walked to each piece of furniture and moved it, checking behind it. I searched for hidden speakers. I looked behind the curtains. I lifted the mattress. I opened the drawers of the dresser. I found nothing unusual. Everything looked normal. The room was completely plain. There were no signs that anyone had tampered with it. My hands were shaking a little. I felt a knot in my stomach. I kept thinking that maybe I was losing it, but the whispering was too real. I couldn't just dismiss it. It was definitely coming from the outlets. I tried turning off the main light switch again. The overhead light went dark, but the whisper remained. I unplugged the lamp again, turned off the air conditioner, and listened. Still there. I considered leaving the room and sleeping in my car. It would be uncomfortable, but at least I wouldn't hear that voice. I grabbed my bag and stepped out into the hall. The hallway was dead quiet. I walked to the door leading outside. I stood there looking at my car. The idea of leaving felt like giving up. It made no sense that I was hearing these voices. What if I told someone about it and they thought I was hallucinating? I wanted proof that something was wrong with this place. I turned back and went into the room again. I approached the outlet by the bed. I listened carefully to the words. The voice described a man holding a document. He wore a gray suit, glasses, and had a ring on his left hand. He was standing in an office with beige walls and fluorescent lights. The voice spoke in a calm, almost monotone manner. Then it moved on to a woman rearranging boxes in a storage room. Then a group of people sitting at a conference table, all looking at their phones. I couldn't place any of these scenes. They didn't sound like anything special, just ordinary moments happening somewhere else. I knocked on the wall next to the outlet. I hit it with my fist a few times, just enough to see if the voice reacted. It did not. It kept talking at its own pace. I said, "Hello?" out loud, right into the outlet. No response. I tried again. "Can you hear me?" Nothing. The whispering just continued, ignoring me completely. My body felt tense. My neck was stiff. I swallowed hard and rubbed my face with my hands. I paced the room, trying to think. I decided to try the breaker box. Sometimes motels have breaker panels accessible. I stepped into the hall and looked around. I found a small paneled door by the vending machine near the lobby. It was unlocked. Inside were several switches labeled by room number. I found room 16 and flipped the switch off. The corridor light stayed on, but I assumed I had cut power to my room. I walked back inside the dark room. I stood there, holding my breath, and listened. The whispering was still there. I had cut power and it still spoke. It was as if it didn't rely on electricity at all. I backed out into the hallway and closed the door. I stood in the hall, thinking about what to do next. I could try other rooms. Maybe the voice was only in mine. I walked down the hall, listening at door after door. Most rooms were quiet. At room 14, I pressed my ear to the door. Nothing. Room 18, nothing. Everything sounded normal outside my room. I went back to the lobby. The front desk was still empty. I said, "Hello?" Again. No one came. I saw a door behind the desk that might lead to a back office or a manager's room. I knocked on it. Nothing. I tried the knob. It was locked. I stood there in silence, feeling the sweat under my armpits. I was wide awake now, no chance of sleeping. I returned to my room, turned the breaker back on, and flicked the lights. I sat on the bed and stared at the outlet. The whispering continued. It never addressed me, never paused. It just went on, describing unknown people in unknown places, all doing ordinary things. I tried to pick out any detail that made sense, something I could use to identify what I was hearing. The voice mentioned a building number at one point, said something about room 305 and a reception desk, but it never explained where this was happening. I noticed my heartbeat was faster. I tried to calm down by focusing on simple tasks. I rolled my shoulders, stretched my neck, and took a sip of water in the bathroom. I turned the faucet on and let it run, just to have another sound in the room. Over the running water, I could still hear the whisper. I splashed water on my face again, patted it dry with a thin towel. Then I decided I couldn't stay. It wasn't about the money. I needed to get away from that voice. It felt like something was in the walls, something that was collecting secrets and broadcasting them to anyone who stayed here. The voice never threatened me directly, but hearing these private details of strangers felt invasive, like I was part of something I should not be hearing. It gave me chills. It made my skin crawl. I packed my bag, threw everything inside haphazardly, and stepped out. I closed the door firmly and walked straight to my car. The parking lot was quiet and empty. I looked at the sign on the motel wall. The neon light buzzed faintly. I got in my car and turned the engine on. I looked back once through the windshield at the rows of doors. I wondered if anyone else was hearing it too. But no one came out. No one complained. I backed out of the space and drove onto the main road. I looked at the time. 3:27 a.m. I'd had only a few hours of rest, but I needed to put distance between me and that place. I kept driving until I found a gas station. I pulled in, got out, and the cool air felt clean. I could still feel a slight tension in my body, but at least I was gone from the motel. Inside the gas station store, a young guy at the counter said, "Hey, how's it going?" And I almost laughed. After what I had just gone through, it was good to hear a normal voice. I bought a bottle of water and a pack of gum. He gave me change and said, "Have a safe drive." I nodded, walked back outside, and got in my car. For a moment, I listened carefully, making sure I couldn't hear any whispering. Just the hum of my engine and a distant truck passing on the road. Everything else was quiet and normal. I put the car in gear and drove, leaving the motel behind with its strange, unstoppable voice buried in the walls. I arrived at that old Victorian mansion late in the afternoon. I had a small bag with a few clothes, a flashlight, and some basic tools. My job was to watch over the place while the owners were away for a few weeks. They told me it was old, that it needed someone around at night to keep an eye on it. They said something about the wiring being weak, about some doors jamming when it got cold, and about a strange grandfather clock inside that never kept proper time. I didn't ask many questions. I just agreed to do the job because I needed the money. They gave me a set of old keys and left. I did not see their car after that. When I stepped through the front door, I had to push hard because the old wood seemed swollen. The foyer smelled like old paper, dust, and something like wet carpet. There was a large staircase in front, going up to the second floor. On both sides, hallways stretched out. The air felt heavy. I heard a faint ticking sound right away. It came from deeper inside the house. It wasn't steady. It clicked and paused, then clicked again, sometimes fast, sometimes slow. I walked across the foyer, my boots making dull thuds on the old wooden floor. There were framed photographs and paintings on the walls, mostly faded. I saw a coat rack, empty except for a single old scarf covered in dust. I rubbed my nose because the dust was bothering me. I followed the ticking sound. I moved to the left hallway, passing a couple of closed doors. I tried the knobs on each door as I passed. One door opened into a sitting room. It had armchairs and a low table with a vase. Another door led to a small study lined with shelves full of old books that smelled like mold. The ticking sound was louder now. I found the clock in the next room. It was a tall grandfather clock, placed against the far wall. The face was worn, the glass scratched. The pendulum swung from side to side, but not at a steady pace. It would swing 3 times slow, then 1 time fast, then pause, then move again. I frowned. The time on the clock was wrong. It showed something like 2:15, but my watch said it was nearly 5:30. I shrugged. Maybe the owners forgot to mention how broken it was. I stood there and watched it for a minute. The pendulum made a soft scraping sound, like metal on metal. Sometimes it caught for a second, then jerked forward. I reached out and touched the side of the clock, feeling the wood. It felt damp. I tried to open the front panel, but it was stuck. I didn't want to force it because I didn't know if I'd break something valuable. I decided to look around the mansion more, to see where I would sleep and what kind of food supply they left. I turned away, but then I heard a sudden chime. It was a hollow sound, almost like someone hitting a pipe. I turned back to see the clock. The hands had jumped. Now it said 6 o'clock, but my watch said 5:32. The chime echoed through the hallway. I felt a chill on my arms. Something about that sound bothered me. I couldn't explain why. I listened for a while, but it did not repeat. I left the room and walked toward the kitchen. I passed the foyer again. I noticed the armchairs in the sitting room. I could see inside as I passed. The chairs were in different positions now. They were not facing the low table anymore. I could see the legs of the chairs at odd angles, like someone had pushed them around quickly. I stepped inside that room again. I looked at the table. The vase was gone. I looked around, saw it on a small side table near the window. I was sure it had been on the low table. I tried to remember if maybe I just missed it. I didn't think so. I didn't touch anything. I stood still. I didn't hear anything except the faint ticking, which sounded distant now. I continued to the kitchen. The kitchen had old cabinets, a rusted sink, and a small refrigerator that hummed. There was some bread on the counter, half stale, and some cans of soup in a cupboard. I opened the fridge. There was a bottle of water and some butter. I took the water and drank some. The aftertaste was metallic. I put it back. I checked the back door. It led outside to a small yard covered in tall grass. The sky was starting to get dark. I decided to pick a bedroom on the second floor for the night. The owners told me I could pick any guest room. I carried my bag upstairs. The steps creaked. The upstairs hallway had a row of doors. I opened them one by one. The first was a bathroom. The second, a locked door that wouldn't budge. The third was a musty bedroom with a large bed and a dresser. There was a window facing the yard. I set my bag on the bed. It smelled dusty, but at least the mattress felt firm. I checked the dresser drawers. They were empty. The air felt colder upstairs. I rubbed my hands together. I spent some time checking the windows and making sure the doors locked. When I went downstairs again, I noticed something strange. The hallway where I found the clock now looked different. The walls were the same, but the door placement seemed off. I remembered the clock was at the end of that hallway, but now when I looked down it, I couldn't see the clock. I walked carefully, checking each door. I found a dining room that I didn't remember passing before. Inside it, the chairs and table were arranged in a circle, all facing inward. The table had nothing on it. I tried another door. It led back to the foyer. I went around again and tried to reach that clock room. Somehow I kept ending up in the wrong rooms. I was sure I was following the same route as before, but each time I passed through a door, the room seemed to shift. I started to panic a bit. I stood in the foyer, looking at the front door. It was locked from inside. I knew how to unlock it, but I had agreed to stay. I wasn't sure if leaving was wise or not. The place was strange, but maybe I was just tired. I decided to sit on the stairs and think. While sitting there, I heard another chime. It was louder this time. I stood up and tried to locate the sound. It came from somewhere upstairs now, or so it seemed. I climbed the stairs, listening. As I reached the top, another chime sounded. It echoed in my ears. I passed the bathroom door. Ahead, I saw a faint glow coming from a room at the end of the hall. I walked slowly. My heart was beating faster. I entered the room. It was the same bedroom I chose earlier, but the bed was missing. The dresser was not there either. Instead, I saw the grandfather clock against the far wall, its pendulum swinging. The hands pointed to a time that made no sense. It read 3:45, but it was already night outside. I stepped closer. The pendulum moved oddly, sometimes pausing mid-swing. Each time it paused, I felt a slight pressure in my chest. Then it would jerk forward and the pressure would ease. I tried to move around the room, but there was less space now. The walls seemed closer together. The window was there, but it looked smaller, and the glass seemed thicker. I heard the tick and tock sounds, but they were irregular. Sometimes it would go tick, tick, tock, then pause, then tock again. I decided to leave the room, but the door was not in the same place. I felt along the wall for the doorknob. My fingertips touched wood panels that felt damp and rough. Finally, I found the door and pushed it open. I stepped out into a hallway that looked different. The wallpaper had strange patterns, and I could see my own shadow stretching at odd angles under the moonlight that came in through some high window. I tried to follow the hallway. It led me back downstairs, but the steps were narrower, and I had to hold the railing to keep my balance. Downstairs, I heard a scraping sound. I walked toward it. I entered a room with a large sofa and a low cabinet. I saw shapes shifting in the corners, but when I looked directly at them, I only saw furniture. The shapes seemed to appear in the corner of my vision. I tried to ignore them. I approached the sofa and touched it. The fabric felt rough. I turned to leave, but I heard the scraping again, like wood against wood. I looked over my shoulder. The sofa was slightly rotated now, as if it had moved silently. My breathing was shallow. I felt sweat on my back. I looked around the room and tried to find the doorway I came through. Instead, I saw a different door, half open, leading to a narrow hall. I went through it. Inside, I found a small storage room with shelves. The shelves were bare except for a small lantern. I picked it up. I shook it. It had a bit of oil inside. I lit it with my lighter. The flame flickered but stayed lit. Now I had some extra light. I returned to the previous room. The sofa was gone. In its place, I saw a chair and a small table. On the table, there was a pocket watch. I picked it up and checked it. The watch was not ticking. Its hands were stuck. I put it down and left it there. I realized I needed to find a stable point in the house, maybe the foyer or the kitchen, something that did not change. I tried to make my way back. Each door led to a slightly different arrangement of rooms. Sometimes I recognized a painting or a lamp. Other times I saw unfamiliar furniture. The dust was always present. My throat felt dry. I listened for the clock. I heard faint ticking somewhere ahead. I followed the sound. I found myself in a corridor with a window at the end. The moonlight shone through. I tried opening the window. It stuck. I pushed harder. It opened a crack. I felt cold night air on my face. I looked outside. I saw the tall grass, some old trees, and a fence in the distance. Everything looked normal outside. The moonlight was bright. I took a deep breath. My heart slowed a bit. I closed the window and turned around. The corridor was empty, but now I noticed the smell of something burning. I followed the scent to a room on my right. Inside, there was a fireplace with old ashes. No fire now, just cold ashes. I touched them. They felt dry and cold. I thought maybe the smell came from old wood somewhere else. I left the room. I wandered for a while, trying doors, checking rooms. Each time I thought I knew where I was, I found a new arrangement. Sometimes the grandfather clock appeared in unexpected places. Once it stood in a corner of a hallway, ticking slowly. Another time I found it in a closet, silent and still. I tried to ignore it, but every so often it chimed. The chime always made me flinch. When it chimed, I saw the furniture shift in the corner of my eye. After each chime, I had to orient myself again. At one point, I reached the foyer again. The coat rack was still there, but now there were 2 scarves instead of 1. The door outside was still locked. I could see the old keyhole. My keys were upstairs in the bedroom I chose. I decided to get them. I climbed the stairs carefully. The steps creaked louder now. The upstairs hallway seemed shorter. I found the bedroom door. Inside, I saw my bag on the floor. The bed was back. The dresser was there too, but the clock was gone. I opened my bag and took out the keys. I held them in my hand. I felt a bit better. I decided to try the front door. I went downstairs, stepping slowly, listening for the clock. I didn't hear it. Downstairs, I approached the front door. I tried the keys. They didn't fit right. I tried each key carefully. None turned the lock. The door was stuck. I pulled, pushed. Nothing happened. I tried the windows in the foyer. They were sealed tight. I tapped the glass. It felt thick and solid. I couldn't break it easily without proper tools. I only had a small set of tools, nothing heavy enough to break old glass. I checked my watch. It read close to midnight. I felt tired. My stomach was empty. I remembered the soup cans in the kitchen. I decided to eat something. I found my way back to the kitchen, though the path felt different again. The kitchen cabinets were still there. I found the bread, now harder, and the cans of soup. I opened a can with my pocket knife and ate cold soup. It tasted bland, but it calmed my stomach. I drank some water again. Still metallic, but I swallowed it. I looked around the kitchen. I saw a small door that I hadn't noticed before. I opened it. A pantry, empty shelves, and a broom. Nothing else. I closed it. I returned to the hallway. The house was quiet now. I walked slowly, holding the lantern. My feet scuffed on the floor. Dust rose in small clouds. I wiped sweat from my forehead. I tried to find a place to rest until morning. I hoped that in daylight things would be normal. I went back to the bedroom upstairs and sat on the bed. It felt stiff. I lay down. The mattress was rough and smelled old. I kept my eyes open, staring at the ceiling. The lantern flickered. I placed it on the floor. I tried to keep calm, breathing slowly. My mind was blank, just focused on getting through the night. Time passed slowly. I heard distant ticking, sometimes faster, sometimes slower. I heard occasional scraping sounds. The floorboards creaked as if someone was walking outside the door, but when I opened the door, I saw an empty hallway. Each time I checked, the hallway looked slightly different. The wallpaper patterns shifted. Sometimes the pattern was simple stripes, other times small floral patterns. The smell changed too, sometimes dusty, sometimes musty, sometimes just stale air. I stayed in that bedroom for a long time, holding the lantern, listening for the chimes. Eventually, I heard another one. It was louder now, echoing through the halls. I stood up quickly. The door was open. I saw the grandfather clock again, right outside the bedroom, ticking slowly. I hadn't seen it appear there. It just was there now. I approached it carefully. I reached out and grabbed the sides. It felt solid. I tried to tilt it, but it was heavy. I tried to open the front panel again, and this time it opened with a squeak. Inside, I saw the pendulum swinging irregularly. The weights and chains looked rusted and tangled. I reached in and tried to stop the pendulum. I pressed my hand against it. It felt cold. It slowed, stopped for a second, then pulled out of my grip and continued swinging. My hand slipped and I hit my knuckles on the inside of the case. I felt pain and cursed softly. The clock chimed again. The hallway shifted. I looked over my shoulder. The bedroom door behind me was gone. I only saw a blank wall. I turned back to the clock. The hands pointed at a random time, something like 9:20. I backed away, keeping my eyes on it. I decided to keep moving, to not stay still. I walked down the hallway. The floor felt uneven. I had to step carefully. I tried doors at random, opening and closing them. Some led to empty rooms, some to rooms with furniture piled up. I saw chairs stacked on top of each other, cabinets turned sideways, rugs hanging from the ceiling. Every time the clock chimed, I saw things move at the edges of my vision. My breathing was fast. My palms were sweaty. I kept thinking that if I waited long enough, maybe morning would come and I could get out. The owners said a few weeks, but I just needed one night to get paid for the first shift. They never warned me about this. They just said, watch the house. I wondered if they knew. I tried to ignore that thought. I focused on walking, on checking doors, on keeping calm. After a long time, I found the foyer again. I recognized the stairs. The coat rack had 3 scarves now. I ignored that. I tried the front door again, still stuck. I went into the sitting room. The armchairs were back to their original positions, facing the low table. The vase was on the table now. I looked at it closely. It was cracked. I tapped it with my fingernail. It made a dull sound. I sat in one of the armchairs. It felt firm. I tried to rest, listening. The clock was silent now. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the empty fireplace, hearing only my own breathing. The lantern flame danced on the walls. I watched the shadows. Sometimes I thought I saw shapes in them, but when I looked directly, there was nothing. Just old furniture and dusty floors. I tried to stand up, but my legs were stiff. I stretched, took a deep breath, and stepped back into the foyer. I walked to the window next to the door and looked outside. I saw the sky starting to lighten just a bit. The moon was lower. Dawn was near. I stood there, pressing my forehead against the glass, feeling its cool surface. I waited. There was no more chiming. The clock was quiet. The furniture stayed in place. I stood still, waiting for morning, hoping that when the sun rose, I could open the door and leave. I held the keys tight in my hand. My knuckles were sore from before. I listened carefully, but I only heard silence now. I waited. I set up my tent in the swamp late in the afternoon. The ground felt wet under my boots and my ankles sank whenever I stepped on a soft spot. Thick mist drifted through the trees, clinging to every branch and root. Water pooled around uneven patches of earth. The smell of decaying leaves and old water hung everywhere. I came here to escape people, traffic, and light. I wanted silence. I wanted to sit in the dark and not worry about anyone asking me questions. I wanted to sleep in my own space without interruptions. The swamp seemed empty enough, and I expected nothing but crickets and distant frogs. I set my small tent near a few tree roots that felt stable enough. I placed my sleeping bag inside and unrolled it carefully. I checked the stakes and rope twice to make sure it would hold if the weather changed. I had a flashlight, a small camping stove, and a sealed bag of dried food. My boots were muddy, and my pant legs were damp from the knees down. As the light faded, I sat on a small folding stool outside the tent and tried to keep my back straight. My shoulders ached from carrying my gear. I took out my canteen and swallowed a few gulps of lukewarm water. I chewed on a piece of dried meat and listened. I heard distant bubbling sounds. I heard faint pops, as if small creatures broke the water surface now and then. I tried to ignore the smell of stagnant mud. I did not see any other people. I did not see animal tracks that worried me. There were no loud birds, just small chirps lost in the distance. When the last bit of daylight disappeared, I turned on my flashlight and aimed the beam at the tent. My shoulders tensed because I could not see far. The swamp spread out in all directions, but the mist and darkness swallowed everything more than a few steps away. The flashlight showed me the tree roots, some low shrubs, and the surface of the muddy water. Little bits of reflection danced on the surface. I noticed how quiet it became. I expected frogs, but at that moment, there were none. The silence pressed on me. I gripped the flashlight harder. I forced myself to breathe slowly. I got inside my tent and zipped it closed. The nylon fabric felt thin. I knew that if I heard something outside, I would see only a vague shadow through the material. I settled inside. I spread out my sleeping bag and placed my pack by my feet. My back felt stiff, and I tried to relax by lying flat. I took off my boots and placed them at the entrance of the tent. I heard my own breathing inside the cramped space. I waited for sleep. I waited for some natural sound, maybe insects or a gentle breeze. But I heard only my heart beating. I dozed off for maybe a few minutes, maybe an hour. I woke up when I heard a strange noise. It was slow, deep, and uneven. It sounded like breathing, but not a normal kind. It was a wet, gurgling breath. It came from outside, not close, but not far. I sat up. My head touched the top of the tent. I held my breath and listened again. I heard it once more. It sounded heavier now, like lungs filled with thick fluid, pushing air out through layers of something soft and damp. There was a slight pause, then the inhale, then another pause, then the exhale. I could not tell if it was an animal or something else. It did not sound like a person. It did not have a rhythm I recognized. I picked up my flashlight. My hand shook. I considered turning it on and pointing it at the tent wall, but I was afraid I would make my presence too obvious. My chest felt tight. My palms felt damp. I stayed quiet and tried to figure out if I should open the tent flap. The noise continued, steady but slow. I tried to guess the distance. Maybe it was several yards away near the water. Maybe it was behind a tree stump. I could not be sure. I let out a slow breath through my nose. I reached toward the zipper of the tent door. I moved it a little, just enough to create a narrow gap. Through that gap, I saw gray mist and dark shapes. My flashlight remained off. I waited for my eyes to adjust. The mist swirled at about knee height, drifting across the surface of the swamp. I smelled something new. It smelled mineral, like whetstone and old iron. It made my nose burn. I tried not to cough. The breathing sound got louder. I heard a slight crackling noise, like something pushing through damp leaves or soft mud. I leaned forward and pressed my face to the gap. I saw a shape in the mist. It rose slowly, as if pulling itself upward from the mud. Its outline was long and twisted. I could not see details, only a silhouette. It had no distinct head or limbs that I could identify. It seemed to shift shape as it moved, but never formed a recognizable shape like a person or a known animal. It extended upward, then bent at an angle, then extended again. The slow movements sent ripples through the mist. My legs felt weak. My stomach tightened. I gripped the flashlight, but I did not turn it on. I did not want this thing to notice me. I tried to remain silent, but my breath sounded too loud in my own ears. I pressed my tongue against the roof of my mouth to keep quiet. I could feel sweat under my arms and along my lower back. The shape continued to emerge from the mud. I noticed that as it moved, the mineral smell grew stronger. I also heard a faint wet sound, like thick liquid bubbling. I did not see eyes. I did not see a face. It had a surface that looked smooth in some parts and uneven in others. The silhouette swayed slightly, like a thick vine pulled up from underwater. It did not reach for me. It did not charge or move fast. It seemed to focus on getting its full length out of the mud. The process was slow and deliberate. I thought about packing my gear and leaving. I wondered if I could run. The darkness and the mud would slow me down. My tent was small. If I made noise, I would draw attention. I was not sure if this thing had ears or if it could see light. I did not want to test it. My hands shook. My throat felt dry. I forced myself to swallow and not cough. Minutes passed. My legs began to ache from crouching. The creature's breathing remained steady and thick. The silhouette took on a new angle, leaning slightly toward the water. It made a low gurgle, and I saw something drip off its surface. I heard drops falling into the mud. I smelled a hint of iron in the air. My nose stung. I wanted to move back, but I was afraid to make any sound. I stayed in that position, half kneeling, half crouching. My left foot started to go numb. I shifted my weight slowly, trying not to rustle the nylon of the tent. I kept my eyes on the shape. It did not appear to have a clear front or back. Its top section bent downward, then pulled upward again. The breathing continued, and I felt the sound echo in my chest. There was a constant pressure in the air, as if the sound waves were thick enough to touch. I wondered what this thing was doing. It did not seem to hunt. It did not seem to flee. It just existed there, part of the swamp. I thought maybe it was some kind of swamp life I had never heard of, something adapted to these conditions, something that did not care about me as long as I stayed quiet. That thought did not bring comfort. My skin crawled. My scalp tingled. I felt sweat roll down my forehead. I wiped it with the back of my hand and sniffed quietly. At some point, the creature shifted sideways. It turned, or at least it moved in a direction that suggested a rotation. The silhouette thinned, then widened again. The breathing sound paused. My heart jumped. In that moment, I thought it might have noticed my presence. I pressed my body flat against the ground and held my breath. I could feel the soil pressing into my knees and chest. My arms trembled. I waited. After a few seconds, the breathing resumed. It sounded closer than before, but not by much. I dared to raise my head slightly. I looked through the gap again. The mist thickened. The shape was harder to see now, but I could still sense its position because I could see a slight difference in the way the mist moved around it. It formed a barrier in the swirl of white vapor, a solid object that bent the fog around it. I had a knife in my pack. It was not a large knife. It would not help me if this thing attacked. I did not reach for it. I did not want to move too much. My jaw felt sore from clenching my teeth. My breath came out in short, shallow bursts. I tried to keep my exhale through my nose as quiet as possible. The creature lowered itself closer to the ground. I heard a wet slosh as it touched the mud. It sounded thick and heavy, like a large mass pressing down into the sludge. The mineral smell intensified. I could almost taste it at the back of my throat. My stomach churned. I swallowed and tried not to gag. The air felt heavy and humid. I noticed tiny noises around me, small droplets sliding down my tent's fabric. a faint hum of insects in the distance, a soft crack when I shifted my knee. Each sound made me flinch. I worried that the creature would react. It did not. It seemed focused on whatever it was doing. Its shape twitched now and then, changing angles and lengths, but without any sudden moves. Time passed slowly. I lost track of how long I stayed there. My legs hurt. My shoulders ached. I felt trapped. I thought about tearing open the tent and running, but the idea made my heart race. I had nowhere to run in the dark. The swamp would slow me, and I would make noise. My flashlight would only help me see a few feet ahead. If I tripped, I would be stuck in the mud. I imagined myself calling for help, but there was no one around. I clenched my fist until my knuckles felt stiff. Eventually, the creature began to move away. It happened gradually. I heard the slow movement of something large dragging along the wet ground. The breathing continued, but it grew softer. I saw the silhouette pull back into the mist. It moved in a steady line, leaving my field of view. I waited, straining my ears, expecting some trick. But the sounds grew distant. I did not move for a long time. I waited until I was sure I heard nothing but my own breathing and the faint rustle of leaves. My body felt cramped. My pants were damp from pressing against the floor of the tent. I smelled my own sweat. My mouth tasted stale. I finally dared to open the tent flap a bit wider and shine my flashlight outside. The beam caught nothing unusual, just mud, water, tree roots, and dense mist. There were no footprints that I could see, only soft mud that looked the same everywhere. My heart still pounded. I pulled my boots inside and put them on. My hands shook so much that I had trouble tying the laces. I considered staying the rest of the night and leaving at dawn. Then I considered packing up immediately and trying to find my way out in the dark. The idea of staying there with that thing around frightened me. But leaving in complete darkness, wading through water and mud while the creature might still be nearby, also terrified me. I realized I had no good choices. I decided to wait until there was at least a hint of morning light. I sat inside my tent with the flap open just enough to see outside. I kept the flashlight off to avoid drawing attention. I tried not to think about what I had seen. Instead, I listened carefully for any sign of movement. The minutes dragged on. My muscles twitched. Now and then I picked up the faint odor of that mineral smell on the breeze, but never strong. I guessed it was drifting through the swamp. I felt a dull headache at the back of my skull. After what seemed like hours, a faint gray light appeared in the sky. The mist grew paler. I could see outlines of distant trees. I forced myself to move quietly. I rolled up my sleeping bag. I stuffed everything into my pack. I worked slowly, trying not to make noise. My stomach growled, but I ignored it. My hands were still sweaty. I zipped up my jacket and pushed my arms through the straps of my pack. I slipped out of the tent and crouched low. I looked around. Nothing moved. I took down the tent, folding it as silently as possible. The mud sucked at the tent stakes, but I managed to pull them out with minimal noise. I stuffed the tent into its bag. I stood up slowly, careful with my footing. My boots sank a bit, but I managed to keep my balance. I aimed my flashlight at the ground just enough to see where I stepped. I started walking, following a rough path of higher ground that I had memorized on the way in. The mud and water felt just as cold and heavy as before. My shoulders hurt under the weight of the pack. As I moved away from the campsite, I kept glancing over my shoulder. I saw no shapes. I heard no heavy breathing. I did not smell that mineral odor. The only sounds were my boots pressing into the mud, water dripping from leaves, and the distant hum of insects. My throat felt dry, and I swallowed hard. The air tasted stale. I kept walking, taking careful steps, keeping my eyes forward and listening to every small sound around me. I just wanted to get out of there. I wanted to see open ground and leave that place behind. It took me a long time, but eventually I reached more solid ground. I recognized a few landmarks: a fallen tree with moss, a patch of taller reeds on my left, a cluster of stones where the swamp began to slope upward. My legs felt numb, and my neck was stiff from looking around so much. I never saw that creature again. I never heard its breathing or smelled that mineral odor once I left the heart of the swamp. The fear stayed with me, though. Even hours later, when I finally left the swamp's edge and stepped onto a dirt road, my hands were still shaking and my chest felt tight. I did not look back. I just kept moving, away from that spot, away from whatever lived in that place. I walked into the museum's main hall at around 11 at night. I had just been hired as a night guard. The place was not officially open yet, but they were preparing for a grand reopening in a few days. The corridors were empty, and the walls still smelled like fresh paint. The management told me to patrol the exhibitions and make sure nothing went missing. They said no one should be inside, and that the security cameras were all working. They told me to keep the lights low to save energy, but I could use my flashlight whenever I wanted. I accepted the conditions. It was just a job. I stood near the entrance. The floor felt solid under my boots. The glass doors were locked behind me. I saw my reflection in the glass. I looked tired. I had worked late shifts before, but not in a place like this. I had never worked alone in a big building like this at night. It seemed easy enough. Walk around, check the rooms, report any damage. Still, something felt off. I did not know why. There was nothing strange about the room, just the usual things you would find in a museum lobby. A desk, a few brochures, some potted plants. But I felt an unease that I could not place. I tried to ignore it. I stepped into the first gallery. The lights were dim, but I could make out the shapes of sculptures arranged on pedestals. I flicked on my flashlight and pointed it at a tall statue. It was some ancient piece carved in stone. I did not know the details. I was not there to appreciate the art. I just wanted to make sure everything was in its place. I checked the pedestal's edges, looked for any sign of tampering. Nothing. I moved on to the next piece, a smaller statue, maybe a bust. Again, nothing unusual. I began to relax a bit. The air was cool. My footsteps sounded normal on the floor. Then I noticed something about the shadows. I do not know what caught my attention exactly. Maybe the angle of the beam from my flashlight. I looked down at the shadow of the statue in front of me. The statue was tall, with a head and broad shoulders. Its shadow on the floor should have shown those features. Instead, the shadow looked skewed, with thinner shoulders and a head that seemed too round. I stepped to the side to check if it was just a trick of the angle. The shadow changed shape, but it still did not match the object. The statue remained solid and unmoving, but its shadow looked warped, as if it were cast by something else. I turned off my flashlight and turned it back on. The shadow remained odd. I aimed the light at a painting on the wall. Paintings should cast simple rectangular shadows if the light hits them at a certain angle. This painting, a large canvas in a wooden frame, cast a shadow that did not match a rectangle. It looked like some irregular shape with protrusions that did not match the frame. I tried another painting. Same result. I stood still and breathed slowly. My palms felt damp. I forced myself to keep calm. There was no reason to panic. Maybe there was some unevenness in the surface of the floor or something about the lighting. I tried to ignore it and kept walking. The next few rooms were the same. Sculptures, paintings, and old objects all cast shadows that did not match their forms. Some shadows looked narrower, some wider. Some had strange angles that made no sense. Even small objects, like a vase on a table, cast a shadow that looked taller than it should. I checked the ceiling, thinking maybe there were hidden lights messing with the shapes. I saw nothing. The lighting seemed simple. A few dim ceiling lamps, my flashlight, and the glow from the emergency exit signs. Nothing fancy. As I kept walking, I started hearing odd noises. At first, it sounded like low whispering. I aimed my flashlight around, thinking maybe another guard was here. But I found no one. The voices were too muffled to make out any words. They seemed to come from behind walls or from corners where no one stood. I pressed my ear against a door at one point, trying to catch something clear. I only heard murmurs. They were not loud enough to identify a language or any recognizable words. They just sounded like people whispering to each other, as if discussing something quietly. I called out, "Hello?" and got no response. I checked my watch. About an hour had passed since I arrived. I needed to finish my round. I told myself to stay focused. I continued moving through the galleries. Each room felt colder as I went further in. My flashlight beam shook slightly. I tried to keep my hand steady. My breathing got faster. I told myself it was just my nerves. I tried to concentrate on my duty, check the artworks, ensure nothing was missing, move on. But I could not stop thinking about those shadows. They were everywhere, and none of them looked right. I entered a large hall with tall statues arranged in a circle. They were all of historical figures. I did not know their names. The hall was quiet, and the dim lights made long shadows stretch across the floor. I looked at one statue carefully. It had a human shape, a body, arms, and a head. Its shadow, however, had something like extra shapes on the sides. I knelt and leaned closer to the floor, shining my flashlight at the base of the statue. The pedestal was plain, just a block of stone. But the shadow on the floor showed something that looked like arms bending in a direction the statue's arms did not go. I felt a chill and stood up quickly. I looked around to see if anyone else was in the room. Nothing, just me, the statues, and their wrong shadows. As I moved, I began to notice something else. Sometimes I saw a shadow move at the corner of my vision when I was not pointing the flashlight directly at it. When I turned to look, I saw only normal shapes on the floor. But when I was looking straight ahead and caught something in my peripheral vision, I swore I saw shadows shift slightly. I tested this by walking slowly and turning my head. It kept happening. The shadows looked stable when I focused on them, but seemed to shift when I looked away. I tried to calm myself by thinking about my next step. Maybe I should check the security room. There should be monitors there. If someone was in the building, I could spot them. I followed the signs to the security office. It was a small room near the back, with a desk, a few chairs, and a wall of monitors. The feed was grainy, but I could see the galleries. I watched for a few minutes. Nothing moved on the monitors. No one walked around. The cameras showed only the displays, still and quiet. I did not see any shadows moving on the monitors. They looked normal. I found that strange because I was seeing them differently with my own eyes. I flipped through the camera feeds, checked the entrances, the hallways. Everything looked ordinary on the screens. I rubbed my face and checked the time again. A few hours left until my shift ended. The contract said I just needed to stay until morning. I tried to imagine myself standing here until sunrise. The idea made my stomach tighten, but I had to do it. I needed the job. I decided to keep patrolling. Maybe if I walked faster, I would feel better. I grabbed my flashlight more firmly and returned to the corridors. As I walked, I heard those voices again. This time I tried to follow the sound. I moved slowly, listening. The whispers seemed to come from behind a large locked door labeled storage. I pressed my ear to the door. I could make out a few words, but they did not sound familiar. The voices said names I did not recognize. They repeated them in a low tone. I tried the door handle. It was locked. I considered calling my supervisor, but it was late, and I did not want to admit that I was hearing things. I left the door and moved on. In another gallery, I found a long glass case displaying old tools and pottery. I shined my flashlight along the case. The objects inside were arranged neatly. Their labels were handwritten. As I examined the shadows of these tools, I noticed that some shadows were not attached to the objects at all. When I say not attached, I mean that I saw a tool sitting in the case, and a shadow on the floor near it, but not directly beneath it or behind it. The shadow was a few inches off, as if belonging to something next to it. I tapped on the glass and watched carefully. The object did not move, but the shadow remained where it was, not lining up correctly. I moved on, keeping my footsteps steady, trying not to think too hard about what this meant. As I went deeper into the building, I noticed that some hallways seemed darker than before. The lights on the ceiling looked dimmer. My flashlight's beam felt weaker, or maybe I was just getting more nervous and sweating too much. I could feel my shirt sticking to my back. My throat was dry. I kept swallowing. The silence between the whispers felt heavy. I wondered if I should call someone. The contract said I was alone, and there was an emergency number I could call if something went wrong. But what would I say? That the shadows did not match, and I heard voices whispering strange names? That would not sound reasonable. They might think I was losing it. I decided to handle it myself. I walked into another large gallery full of paintings. These paintings all had spotlights shining on them, so I turned off my flashlight. I stood in the center and looked around. Every painting had a shadow on the wall behind it, but the shapes looked wrong. Instead of showing the rectangular frame, the shadows had uneven edges. Some looked like outlines of shapes I could not identify, as if objects not in the room were being projected. I walked closer to one painting and ran my finger along its frame. The wood was smooth and solid. There were no gaps. I looked at the shadow behind it. The shadow had several bumps that the frame did not have. I leaned in, trying to see if there was some trick of the light. As I got close, I felt the hairs on my arms stand up. My neck felt hot. I backed away and moved on. As the night continued, I noticed that I felt watched. It was not just the strange shadows. I had the sense of eyes on my back whenever I walked down a corridor. I turned around often, shining my flashlight behind me. I never saw anyone. I tried to walk quietly, but my boots echoed. I tried holding my breath and listening. I heard nothing but my own heart pounding. I moved faster, hoping to run out the clock until morning. In one hall, I aimed my flashlight at a suit of armor on display. The armor was on a stand, its metal shining dully. The shadow behind it, however, looked like a hunched figure with a different outline. I looked up and down, trying to see if something else was casting that shape. I did not find anything. I touched the armor's shoulder plate and felt cold metal. I stepped back and aimed the flashlight elsewhere. I thought I saw a shadow move near the corner. I swung the flashlight beam around quickly. There was nothing there, just a blank wall. I began to sweat more. I wiped my forehead with my sleeve. My breath came in short bursts. My stomach felt tight. I told myself to calm down. I just needed to finish this night. I tried to ignore the shadows. I avoided looking closely at them. Instead, I focused on my route. I passed by rows of sculptures and tried not to stare at their shadows. I heard a few whispers now and then, always too soft to understand. They said names that sounded foreign. I tried to tune it out. At one point, I returned to the main hall near the entrance. I looked at the clock on the wall. I still had about an hour to go. I thought about standing still and waiting, but the place felt wrong when I stood still. I felt pressure on my shoulders, as if the air was heavier. So I kept moving. I walked the perimeter again, checking doors, shining my flashlight down corridors. Every so often, I turned suddenly, hoping to catch something off guard. I never caught anything. The shadows remained still whenever I looked at them directly. I counted the minutes as I patrolled. I did not speak out loud. I did not want to hear my own voice echo. The museum was too quiet. I tried tapping my flashlight against my palm a few times to hear a familiar sound. It gave me no comfort. I listened for footsteps other than my own. I heard none. I listened for breathing. Nothing. Just the soft hum of electrical systems and my own heartbeat. Near the end of my shift, I stood in a side gallery and waited. I leaned against the wall. I could see the exit sign in the distance. I counted seconds in my head. While I waited, I kept my eyes on the floor. I saw my own shadow, cast by the emergency lighting behind me. It looked normal. But then I noticed another shadow on the floor next to mine. It had no source that I could see. I looked for an object, a statue. Anything that could cast that shape. There was nothing. I stepped to the side. My shadow moved. The other shadow stayed still. I felt my chest tighten and my hands shake. I stepped closer to it. It did not move. I leaned down and tried to see if there was a bump or a crack in the floor. Nothing. I turned and walked away, refusing to look back. I headed straight for the main hall and waited for my shift to end. My breathing was shallow. I felt sweat trickling down my neck. I swallowed hard and tried to clear my throat. My legs felt stiff. I paced around, checking my watch every minute. Finally, the time came. My shift was over. I unlocked the entrance door and stepped outside. The night air felt cool on my face. I glanced back through the glass. The museum looked quiet and still, but I knew what was inside. I left without lingering. I did not look at my reflection this time. I just walked away, relieved to be out of there, uncertain if I would ever come back. I stepped out of my truck and looked around. It was late afternoon and the barn I had rented stood at the end of a long dirt road in the countryside. I noticed the peeling red paint and the loose boards. The roof looked stable enough. There was no sound except the breeze moving through dry grass. I had chosen this place because I needed quiet. I wanted a few days alone to clear my head. I had paid the owner in advance and received a single key that fit a rusty padlock on the barn door. I had no interest in comfort. I just wanted silence and distance from everyone and everything. Inside, the air smelled of old wood and dust. I saw bales of straw stacked near the corners. A few heavy timbers crossed above me, and I noticed a small loft with a simple ladder. There was a single electric bulb hanging from a cord in the center. I turned it on. The light flickered but stayed on, casting a pale glow. The floor felt uneven under my boots. I carried my small bag, which held a change of clothes, a flashlight, a bottle of water, and a few energy bars. I had no plans to cook. I just planned to sit, read a bit, and sleep. As dusk fell, I settled onto a folded blanket near the wall. I leaned against a support post and tried to relax. The quiet did not calm me as much as I had hoped. The barn felt too still. I heard no insects, no distant cars, nothing. After a while, the wood in the walls began to creak. At first, it sounded normal, like old boards adjusting to temperature changes. Then I noticed something else. The creaking had a pattern, like whispered words. I tried to ignore it, but the noise did not fade. It grew more distinct as the light outside vanished. I stood up and walked around, searching for the source. The walls were rough and smelled musty. I pressed my ear against one board and listened. I heard a faint voice. It was not my imagination. It was too clear for that. It did not sound angry or loud. It was soft and gentle. It said something I could not fully understand. I caught parts of words, maybe names. I heard what sounded like Ian or Anne, and then a broken phrase. Something like, "Get the rope," or "Left it behind." I felt a chill crawl up my arms. I pulled back and stared at the wood. It was just wood. There was no speaker, no radio, nothing that I could see. I checked my phone for a signal. There was nothing. The owner had told me that I would have no reception out here. I tried to tell myself I was tired and my mind was playing tricks. I shined my flashlight along the boards. They were warped and cracked. I saw tiny gaps. Maybe the wind outside made strange sounds as it passed through. I tried to believe that, but I could not shake the feeling that I had just heard real words. I decided to lie down and close my eyes for a bit. Maybe I would feel better if I slept. I spread out my blanket on a section of relatively clean floor. The smell of straw and old dirt filled my nose. I could taste dust on my tongue. I tried to rest, but as soon as I lay still, I heard a new sound. The straw in the corner rustled. I lifted my head and pointed the flashlight toward it. I saw nothing move. The straw sat in a heap. There were loose pieces scattered about, but I could not see anything alive. No rats, no bugs. I leaned closer. The straw shifted again. It did not blow around like normal. It gathered into a small mound that rose about a foot high. The shape looked unnatural, like it had a head and shoulders. I sat up straight, heart pounding. The shape stood out clearly in the dim light. It had no eyes, no mouth, nothing human. But it stayed in that rough form for a few seconds before collapsing back into a shapeless pile. I did not know what to do. My pulse raced. I felt sweat on my neck. My hands shook. I tried to breathe quietly. I told myself to calm down and check it again. I crawled closer, shining the light right onto the straw. It was just straw. I pushed it aside with my boot. It made a dry, rustling sound. After I disturbed it, it just looked like loose straw again. I felt a small relief, but not much. Something about it bothered me. I backed away and sat down again, keeping the flashlight on that spot for several minutes. Nothing happened. Then I heard the voice again. It came from above this time, near the rafters. The wood beams groaned. I heard whispered names. They sounded different now. I thought I heard the name David or Damon. I could not be sure. There were small fragments of sentences. Waiting by the door. And she said not to. I tried to understand, but the voice never spoke in full sentences. It sounded like overhearing a conversation from a room next door. The tone was soft, never rising above a whisper. I stood up and moved the flashlight over the rafters. I saw dust and a few cobwebs, nothing else. No nests, no bats, no sign of anything that could produce a voice. My mouth felt dry. I unscrewed my water bottle and took a sip. The water felt warm and stale. I swallowed anyway. I wanted to leave. But it was night, and I did not feel like driving in total darkness through unfamiliar roads. I tried to stay calm. I would just wait until morning and then decide if I wanted to remain here or not. I tried to sit again. My knees felt weak. My stomach churned. I heard more creaking. It sounded like the wood was bending close to my ears. The voice came again, but now I noticed something else. I could hear breathing. It was very faint, but it was there. It came from the empty air, as if someone stood a few feet away. I shined my flashlight around, looking at every empty corner. The barn was mostly empty except for the straw piles and some old wooden crates along one wall. I checked those crates. They were empty. The dusty smell made me cough. I tried talking out loud. "Who's there?" I asked. My voice sounded small. I expected silence, but instead I heard a soft response. It was not words, just a quiet exhale, like someone sighing. I jumped back, bumping against a post. My heart hammered. I felt my skin tightening on my back. I looked down at the floor, searching for footprints or any sign of movement. The dirt and old wood floor showed nothing but my own tracks. I walked over to the door and pulled on it. It opened easily. Outside, the darkness was complete. I saw stars and the vague outline of trees. The air was cool. I considered getting in my truck and leaving right then, but something made me hesitate. I had paid for this place. I had come here to find peace, and I felt angry that I was panicking. There were no threats, no one attacking me. The whispering did not curse or scream. It only said these strange phrases and names. The straw-shifting shape did not hurt me. It only startled me. Maybe I was tired. Maybe it was some trick of old material settling. Maybe the straw fell in a weird way. I tried to convince myself again that nothing was wrong. I closed the door. The barn was dim. The single bulb cast weak light. I decided to turn it off and rely on my flashlight. Maybe the bulb's humming or flickering was causing me stress. I reached up and pulled the chain. Darkness filled the barn except for my flashlight's narrow beam. In that silence, I heard my own breathing. I forced myself to sit down again and try to rest. Within a minute, I heard it again. The wood whispered. This time it sounded closer, like someone speaking right against my ear. I jerked my head around, pointing the light. Nothing there. I got up and paced the barn from one end to the other. I ran my fingers along the rough boards. I touched the straw. It felt dry, prickly. No heat, no moisture, no hint of life. But when I stepped back, I saw it move again. A small pile in the corner formed a shape with a hollow center, like a figure crouching. It held its form for a few seconds, then fell apart. I pushed the straw aside with my foot, and it scattered into loose strands again. My breath came in quick bursts. My chest felt tight. I clenched my fists. I tried to hold steady. The sound of whispering names kept drifting through the barn. They changed. I heard Robert, Helen, Mark. Sometimes I heard a phrase like "he went outside," or "wait until sunrise," or "not now." All of it sounded random and disconnected. I never heard two lines that formed a coherent conversation. It was like listening to scraps of speech from different times and different people. I checked my watch. It was a little past midnight. The night felt long. I tried to lean against a wall and steady myself. I considered leaving again, but the idea of driving away in darkness still felt worse. I thought maybe if I waited until dawn, I would be able to laugh this off and leave peacefully. So I stayed. I tried to ignore the whispers. I tried to focus on the physical world. I noticed the way the dust motes drifted in my flashlight beam. I smelled the stale scent of old hay. I felt the rough texture of the wooden posts when I touched them. My boots scraped the dirt floor. I let my mind focus on these simple details, but the whispering continued. The wood creaked and groaned. The voices never shouted, never became loud, but they never stopped. Every few minutes I would hear another name, another half sentence. Every time I moved, I felt a presence behind me. I would spin around, shining my light, expecting to see a person. I saw only empty air. At some point, I realized my shirt was damp with sweat. My neck ached from tension. My legs trembled. I tried sitting again, but my body refused to relax. The darkness outside offered no comfort. The barn felt like it held me inside it, even though the door was not locked. I knew I could leave, but I stayed. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that I was not losing control. Maybe I thought if I stayed quiet enough, I would catch a full sentence, some clue that would explain all this. I moved toward the ladder to the small loft area. I climbed up slowly, shining my flashlight ahead. The loft was dusty and empty. I saw a few planks of wood and some old rope. I did not see anything that could whisper. I listened. The voices sounded distant now, as if they were coming from below. I crouched on the loft floor, breathing carefully. I felt the boards creak under my weight. The dust made my nose itch. I waited, holding my breath. I heard no voices for a moment, and I felt a small relief. Then, from directly behind me, I heard a quiet sigh. I swung the flashlight behind me instantly. No one there, just empty space. My stomach clenched, and I scrambled down the ladder. Back on the main floor, I pressed my back to a wall and tried to steady myself. I looked at the door. I could leave, but I told myself I would hold out until morning. I checked my watch again. It was almost 2 a.m. The time passed slowly. The whispers kept coming. The straw kept shifting. Sometimes I saw a shape stand up in the straw pile, resembling a hunched figure. Sometimes I saw a shape like a head or a shoulder. They never lasted long. Each time I approached, the straw fell away. Each time I backed off, I caught a glimpse of another shape forming. It was as if something tried to appear in front of me but could not hold its form. I tried to communicate again. I said, "Hello?" in a quiet voice. No direct answer. I just heard more fragments. "Over there," and "not now." Then a sigh. My skin crawled. I paced around the barn to keep my muscles from stiffening. I shined the light at the walls, the floor, the ceiling. I searched for cracks, holes, anything that could explain the voices. I found nothing but old boards and dust. Time crawled by. I grew more frustrated and scared. At one point, I grabbed a handful of straw and threw it aside, shouting, "Stop!" The sound of my own voice echoed, but the whispers did not stop. They continued in their quiet, patient way. Names drifted through the air. Short phrases, meaningless instructions, random remarks. The shapes in the straw formed and broke apart. The wood creaked, sometimes sounding almost like laughter, sometimes like sobbing. My body felt drained. I realized I would not sleep. I tried to sit anyway, leaning against a post, keeping my flashlight on. Each time I started to relax, I heard another whisper right next to me. It was never loud, never long enough to be understood, just enough to keep me on edge. Eventually, I saw a faint light through a gap in the boards. Dawn must have been approaching. I felt some relief. I stood up and stretched. My shoulders hurt, my mouth felt dry, and I sipped the last of my water. The voices did not fade completely, but they seemed less frequent. I still heard them, but they felt weaker somehow. As the morning light grew stronger, I pulled the door open again and stepped outside. The air smelled fresher. I could see the fields and the outline of distant trees. The barn stood silent behind me. I walked around it, looking at its walls. They were just old planks. The roof looked normal in daylight. The straw inside was just straw. There were no footprints, no signs of anyone else. I stood there for a few minutes, breathing the cool morning air, trying to gather my thoughts. I did not understand what happened that night. I did not know what those voices were or what made the straw move. I only knew that I felt suffocated inside that barn when darkness fell. I felt like I was never alone, even though I saw no one. I could still remember the faint sound of names and random phrases and the sensation of something just behind me. I walked back in and grabbed my bag. I did not want to stay another night. I carried my things out, locked the barn's padlock, and got into my truck. My hands still shook. My forehead felt damp. I started the engine and drove away, leaving the barn behind me. As I drove, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone standing there, but I saw nothing, just the empty road and the silent fields. I walked into the hotel's lobby late in the afternoon around 5. I had been driving for hours and wanted a place to rest before continuing my trip the next morning. The hotel looked old, maybe from the early 1900s. The receptionist wore a neat uniform and spoke quietly. He gave me a room key, told me where to find the elevator, and said the restaurant would close around 9. I nodded and headed toward the main corridor that led to the rooms. At first glance, the corridor looked like any other in a historic hotel. The walls were covered with old wallpaper, the kind with repetitive patterns. The lighting came from old-fashioned lamps fixed to the wall every few yards. The carpet felt thick under my shoes. There were portraits hung evenly along the hallway. Old men in suits and ties, women in formal dresses, a few landscapes that looked faded. Everything smelled like old books and dust, but not unpleasant. It just felt old. I noticed something strange after I passed the first set of guest rooms. The corridor seemed to stretch longer than it should have. From the outside, the building looked like 3 stories with maybe 10 or 15 rooms on each floor. But after walking for about a minute, I expected to see a turn or something that indicated I had reached the far side of the hotel. Instead, the corridor continued in a straight line, doors evenly spaced, lamps glowing softly. I slowed my pace and looked around. The corridor was quiet. I could only hear my own breathing and the soft sound of my footsteps. I turned and looked back toward the lobby. I expected to see the reception desk at the far end, but all I saw was more corridor behind me. I frowned, took a few steps back in that direction, and stopped at a door on my left. I pressed my ear against it. There was a dull sound coming from inside, like a distant hum. I tried the handle, but it was locked. The door looked like a regular wooden door with a small brass knob. When I let go, I noticed that as soon as I stepped away, the hum stopped. I moved to the door across the hall. I listened again. This time, I heard a faint tapping, like someone lightly knocking on a table. I tried the handle, locked again, I took a deep breath and decided to return to the lobby to ask the receptionist if I was on the right floor. I turned around and walked in the direction I came from. I walked for a good 30 seconds and saw nothing change. There were just more doors, more lamps, more old wallpaper, more portraits. I stopped and checked the doors again. Different doors now made different sounds. One door made a faint scraping sound when I pressed my ear against it. Another emitted a soft, low buzzing. Another was completely silent. I touched the wallpaper, trying to see if there was a hidden seam or a door disguised in the wall. It felt dry and rough. I tried to pull at the portrait frames. They were fixed firmly. The lamps were all the same style, all producing a weak yellow light. The corridor temperature felt steady. There was no draft. I couldn't see any windows. I walked faster, heading back in the original direction of my room's location, hoping to see a door number that matched the one on my key. The key had a brass tag with a room number etched on it. It said 214. I started looking at the small plates next to the doors. They had no numbers. They were blank. I moved from one door to the next, checking them carefully. All blank, no room numbers. I looked over my shoulder again. The corridor looked the same in both directions. There was no sign indicating exits or stairs. My heart rate increased. I could feel my pulse in my neck. I tried to stay calm, but my breathing got heavier. I told myself to keep moving. Maybe I missed a turn. I walked on, counting doors as I passed them. After passing about 10 doors, I came to a slight curve in the corridor. It bent to the right. This surprised me because from the outside, the hotel looked rectangular. I followed the curve. After turning the corner, the corridor continued straight again. But now the portraits were different. I recognized one I had seen before. The face of a man with a thick mustache. I was sure I had passed it a few minutes ago. Now it was here again, on this new stretch of corridor. I stared at it closely. The eyes in the portrait seemed to have a faint glow, like tiny reflections of the lamp. I stepped closer. The glow did not disappear. I reached out and touched the frame. It felt normal, just wood and glass. I glanced around, looking for something to use as a marker. There was a small side table against the wall, holding nothing but a glass vase. I picked up the vase and placed it on the floor, right in the middle of the corridor. I walked forward for about 20 steps, counting them carefully. Then I turned around. I expected to see the vase on the floor behind me. Instead, the vase was gone. The corridor looked empty. I swallowed hard and rubbed my hands together. My palms were damp. I wiped them on my pants and kept walking. I tried to ignore the sounds behind the doors. They made me uneasy, but I couldn't do anything about them. The doors were locked, and I didn't have the right keys. I tried a few more handles anyway, shaking them, pushing against them. Nothing opened. The handles felt solid and cool to the touch. The light from the lamps flickered once in a while. I noticed it after a few minutes, a slight dimming, and then a return to normal. I tried to call out for help. My voice sounded strange in the corridor, echoing slightly but never bringing any response. I shouted a few times, louder and louder. No one answered. The corridor just went on and on. After walking for what felt like 15 or 20 minutes, I realized I should have pulled out my phone earlier. I reached into my jacket pocket and took out my cell phone. No signal. I tried to make a call anyway, but it wouldn't connect. I tried a flashlight app. The phone's light worked, but the corridor was already well lit by the lamps. I tried to send a text message, but it wouldn't send. The battery was still fine, at least. I looked at my watch. Almost half an hour had passed since I left the lobby. This made no sense. I decided to try another tactic. I turned around and started walking back, keeping my eyes straight ahead, not looking at the doors or the portraits. I focused on my breathing and counted my steps. After about 40 steps, I looked up. The corridor curved again in the same way as before, leading me past that same mustached portrait. The corridor was looping me around somehow. I felt my chest tighten. My throat felt dry. I tapped the walls, hoping to find a hollow spot. Everything seemed solid. I kicked the side table. It made a dull wooden sound but didn't budge. I tried to lift it, but it was heavier than it looked. I gave up and continued forward. The smell changed after a while. Instead of dust, I smelled something like old leather. I followed the smell to a spot where the carpet looked slightly worn. I knelt down and touched it. The carpet fibers felt damp. I stood up and noticed that one of the doors was slightly ajar. This was the first door I had seen that wasn't locked. I approached it slowly, holding my breath, and pushed it open. Inside was a small, closet-sized room with empty shelves on the walls. A single lamp hung from the ceiling. There was no furniture, no windows, nothing. I stepped inside and looked around. The door behind me stayed open. I tried tapping the walls inside the room. They were solid. I tried shouting again. My voice echoed back at me. I stepped out into the corridor. It looked the same, but now the lamplight seemed brighter. I looked at the floor where the corridor met the closet door. The carpet color changed slightly at the threshold, from a deep red outside to a faded brown inside. I tried removing one of my shoes and leaving it inside the closet. I placed my shoe in the corner and then stepped back into the corridor, leaving the door open. I walked away for a few seconds, then returned. The door was closed again. I opened it. My shoe was gone. The closet was empty. I started to sweat more. My shirt felt damp under my arms. I wiped my forehead and forced myself to stay quiet. I didn't want to start yelling or doing something useless. I wanted to find a way out. I tried another door. Locked. Another. Locked. I tried the next one. Locked. I kicked the base of the door. It made a hollow sound, but the handle wouldn't budge. I looked closely at the hinges, but they seemed normal. I couldn't remove them without tools. My stomach growled. I realized I was hungry and thirsty. I hadn't eaten since lunch. I looked for a sign of anything edible or drinkable. Nothing. Just the corridor, doors, lamps, wallpaper, and portraits. I noticed that some of the portraits had different frames now, as if they had changed while I wasn't looking. The eyes in some of the portraits still seemed to glow. I got closer to one portrait and stared at it for a while. The eyes reflected the light from the lamps, but there was a strange intensity in them. I touched my face, checking if I was hallucinating. I still felt normal, just tired and stressed. I tried to guess how long I had been stuck. Maybe an hour, maybe more. I decided to focus on concrete steps. I would walk in one direction, counting my steps, and look for any difference. I took slow, measured steps, counting up to 50. At step 50, I looked around. Everything seemed the same. I started again, counting up to 100. At 100 steps, I stopped. The corridor still looked the same. No exit, no stairwell, no elevator. I thought about breaking a lamp. Maybe I could use a piece of broken glass to pry a door open. I reached for a lamp mounted on the wall. I tried to twist it, to pull it off, but it wouldn't move. It felt like it was part of the wall. I tried hitting it with the palm of my hand. It didn't break or even crack. I kicked the wall beneath it. Nothing happened. I stepped back and tried to calm my breathing. My heart was pounding. I could feel sweat sliding down the sides of my face. I heard a faint scraping sound behind me. I spun around. Nothing there. I walked back the way I came, moving faster this time. I passed door after door, not bothering to stop and listen anymore. After a few minutes, I noticed that the corridor began to slope downward as if going underground. The angle was slight, but I could feel it in my knees. I followed the slope. After a while, the floor leveled out again. Then I came to another curve, this time to the left. After following it, I saw something different. The wallpaper pattern changed completely. It went from a floral pattern to plain vertical lines. I touched it. It felt the same texture, but it looked newer. I looked at the lamps. Now they had square bases instead of round. The doorknobs were different too. Instead of brass, they looked like steel. I tried one. It rattled a little but didn't open. The air felt cooler. I inhaled slowly. I kept walking, determined to find some kind of exit or at least a familiar landmark. After more walking, I finally saw something that made me stop. The corridor ended. There was a heavy wooden door at the end with a sign that said lobby in neat letters. I didn't trust it right away, but I had no other choice. I grabbed the handle and pushed. It swung open smoothly. I stepped through and found myself back in the hotel's main lobby. The lobby looked exactly the same as before. Same receptionist behind the desk, same front doors, same chairs and tables. I turned around and looked behind me. The corridor looked normal now. It was just a short hallway leading to the elevator and the guest rooms. No endless line of doors, no strange curves. My heart was still beating fast. I wiped the sweat from my forehead and approached the receptionist. He looked at me calmly. I asked him about the corridor. He just smiled politely and said everything was fine, that maybe I was tired. I looked back at the corridor again. It looked completely normal, only a dozen doors or so, and I could see the door with my room number at the end. I looked at my watch. Less than an hour had passed since I arrived. I said nothing else to the receptionist. I walked to my room and opened the door. The room looked ordinary. A bed, a table, a chair, a window with a view of the street outside. I checked my phone. The signal was back. I tossed my jacket on the bed and sat down, catching my breath. My shirt stuck to my back. My legs felt tired. I decided to stay in the room, lock the door, and rest. I looked out the window. The sky was getting dark. I told myself I would leave first thing in the morning, no matter what. I wanted to get far away from that corridor, and I never wanted to ask about it again. I just wanted to sleep and forget the whole thing. I pushed the back door open at the end of another day, and the stale odor of dust and old wood hits me right in the face. I stand there with my hand on the door handle, breathing slowly, trying not to gag. It's the same smell every evening. I step inside and flick the light switch on. I see dim yellow light spread across the shelves and glass cases. The store is empty. No one else is here. I locked up the front door about half an hour ago after the last customer left. Now I just have to finish my routine, check the cabinets, set the alarm, turn off the lamps, and make sure nothing is out of place. I know what's going to happen when the sun sets completely, but I need this job. I close the back door behind me and wait a few seconds, listening. I hear nothing at first. The store is cramped with old furniture, glass cases filled with small brass objects, worn leather-bound books, carved wooden boxes, and old china. The walls are lined with shelves holding clocks, lamps, vases, candle holders, and mirrors. I move slowly between the aisles, avoiding the low tables and stools that are always in awkward places. My footsteps sound dull on the old floorboards. I keep track of my breathing. I try to keep it steady. I look up at the stained glass windows near the ceiling. They are small but bright, showing geometric patterns during the day. Now they are dark except for some faint glow from the street lamps outside. They don't show anything strange yet, so I relax a bit. I walk to the front of the store. The front door is locked. I give it a quick pull to make sure. I run my hand along the old wooden counter where we keep the register. The surface feels rough and dry. The cash register is already shut down. I glance at the old brass clock on the wall behind the counter. It has no pendulum, and its keyhole is empty. Its hands point randomly to some hour that doesn't make sense. I never touch it. The owner told me not to wind it. He said it's broken. I shrug and check the shelves behind the counter. Nothing is missing. Everything looks fine. I realize the street outside is getting darker. The sun must be almost gone. I walk back toward the center of the store. The floor creaks under my boots. I know that soon the floorboards will start making patterns of sound. It's not random. The first time I heard it, I tried to ignore it. That never helped. I just need to do my tasks and get out. I head to a tall wooden cabinet on the left side of the store. It's filled with porcelain dolls, teapots, and tiny ceramic figurines. I open it and check if everything is in order. The figurines are all there, lined up in neat rows. I close the cabinet and feel the first hint of tension in my shoulders. I hear something click behind me. I turn around. One of the large grandfather clocks against the wall is swaying slightly. It's not wound, I know it's not. I step toward it. Its hands start moving. I watch them jerk forward. The clock face is cracked. I can see the gears inside. They turn on their own. I reach out and put my hand against the glass. It's cold. I feel the tiny vibrations of something forcing its way through old metal parts. I back away. It's starting earlier tonight. I hear a low ringing sound. At first it's just one clock, then another joins. Soon, 3 or 4 of them are ringing at once, their chimes mixing in a disorganized clang. I grip my keys in my pocket. I know that every clock in this place will start ringing in a few minutes. It happens every night. I can never figure out why. The owner claims he doesn't know. I don't ask him anymore. I just accept it. I walk around the store, turning off some table lamps. The electricity is not a problem. The lights are stable, but I prefer to work with minimal lighting once I'm done with the main checks. I've found that bright light makes things worse sometimes. The reflections on the glass cases and mirrors become more noticeable. At some point, the reflections start behaving in ways that make me sweat. They track my movements. They stare at me. I try not to look directly at the mirrors, but I have to pass by them. They cover so many walls. I pass one mirror with a heavy wooden frame. It's about shoulder height. I see my face in it. My face looks normal at first. I look tired and pale, and there's a line of sweat on my forehead. But then I see my reflection's eyes. They are not following my exact motion. When I tilt my head slightly, my reflection tilts its head, but with a delay, like it's thinking about it. I step back, holding my breath. My stomach feels tight. I blink fast. I look away from the mirror and keep walking. The floor starts to creak more rhythmically now, as if each board is being pressed by some invisible foot in a fixed sequence. The pattern runs along the length of the store, from the front door to the back door and back again. I try to ignore it. I focus on the tasks. I have to set the alarm before I leave. The alarm panel is near the back door. I walk there. I punch in my code, but the panel's small screen flickers. The code doesn't register. I try again. The panel gives a faint beep, then goes blank. I feel my heart beating faster. Without the alarm set, I have to explain to the owner. He will ask questions I don't want to answer. I push the panel's buttons harder. Still nothing. The clocks are ringing louder now. I hear their metal clang behind me. I feel the vibrations under my feet. I turn around and see the aisle full of old clocks rocking on their shelves. Some are small mantel clocks, others are large grandfather clocks. They swing their pendulums even though I never wound them. They all chime together now, creating a single continuous tone that makes my teeth hurt. I want to leave, but I still have to make sure the back windows are locked. I have a flashlight in my pocket. I take it out, click it on, and walk toward the back windows. The beam of light is weak, but enough to see the window latches. They are all closed. I reach out to touch one latch and feel a sudden cold draft on my neck. I turn around fast. Behind me there's a section of the store with stained glass panels on the upper parts of the walls. They were dark before. Now there's a faint glow behind them. I see shapes forming in the glass. The colors twist into vague human-like faces. They have wide mouths and misshapen cheeks. Their eyes are empty holes. They grin. They don't move. They just stare. I breathe through my mouth, trying not to make noise. My legs feel weak. My hands shake. I point the flashlight toward them. The light doesn't change anything. They stay there, frozen in place, staring with those empty eyes. I swallow hard and turn away. I can't do anything about them. I move along the back wall, checking each window latch. My flashlight shakes in my hand. I notice my knuckles are pale. The floor creaking is louder behind me. The pattern repeats like a loop. Creak, pause, pause. I ignore it. I reach the last window and see my reflection in the glass. It's just a faint reflection, but enough to see my own eyes. They look wide and scared. I notice my reflection's head turn slightly before I move mine. That's enough for me. I step away from the window and walk quickly toward the front of the store. I almost trip on a low stool. I kick it aside and it scrapes against the floor. The sound is sharp. The clocks ring again all at once, loud and clear. I cover my ears for a second, grit my teeth, and force myself forward. I reach a set of mirrors on one wall. They are arranged in a row, each with a different frame: gilded wood, chipped paint, iron, and brass. I can't avoid looking at them because they reflect the path to the exit. I see myself from different angles. In one mirror, I stand straight. In another, my reflection's head tilts to the side. In another, I see my reflection's eyes locked on me, not blinking. My throat feels dry. I try not to think. I step forward. My reflection in one of the mirrors just watches me. Its mouth is shut tight and its eyes are wide open. It looks like a statue. I raise my hand to my face. My real hand moves normally, but in one mirror, the reflection's hand moves slower, trailing behind. I try to ignore it. I keep walking. I see the front door ahead. It's my only way out. I can't set the alarm, but I can lock the door behind me and leave. I just have to finish the nightly checklist. I realize I forgot to check a small glass case near the center aisle. I hesitate. If I don't check it, I might be blamed for anything missing. I bite my lip and turn around. I walk back, passing the mirrors again. The reflections still move strangely. I feel sweat running down my back. My shirt sticks to my skin. The air smells musty. I taste dust in my mouth. I stop in front of the glass case. Inside are old brooches, pins, and pocket watches. I bend down and shine my flashlight inside. Everything is there. I see a few watches with long-dead batteries, but they tick now, faintly. I squint and watch their tiny hands move in unison. This makes my legs feel weak again. I stand up straight. I hear the floor creak behind me. I feel like something is leaning over my shoulder, but I don't see anything when I turn around. Just shelves and cabinets in dim light. The stained glass faces are still there, grinning. I see them out of the corner of my eye. I need to leave. I walk toward the front door. As I pass one of the large mirrors, I hear a faint scraping sound. I stop and turn to look. The mirror's glass is clean and shows my reflection, but my reflection isn't copying me now. It stands still while I lean in. I breathe slowly and see my reflection's chest not moving. Its eyes look right at me. I raise my hand. The reflection raises its hand after a pause. I lower mine. It lowers its after another pause. My heart pounds. I step back. The reflection steps back, but not in sync. Its movement lags. I walk away, not looking back. The floor creaks in the same pattern, but it feels louder now. I reach the front door and grab the key from my pocket. My hand is slippery with sweat. I unlock the door, pull it open, and step outside. I feel cool night air on my face. It's quiet out here. I turn around and look back into the store for a second. The inside looks calm and still. The clocks are quiet now. I hear no chimes. The stained glass panels look normal. No faces. The mirrors reflect the interior without delay. Everything is as it should be. I lock the front door carefully, testing it twice to make sure it's secure. I walk away, my legs feeling heavy and my stomach twisted. I wipe my forehead with my sleeve and keep going until I reach my car. I sit in my car for a moment and breathe. My shirt is damp. I can't calm down easily. I look at my hands on the steering wheel. They are shaking. I don't know why this happens every night. I can't talk to anyone about it. I can't risk losing this job. I just have to do it again tomorrow. I start the engine and pull away from the curb. In the rear view mirror, I see the store's sign fading behind me. It's just an old building with antiques. Nothing special. But inside, after dark, everything changes. I don't understand it. I know I never will. I drive home, gripping the wheel tight, trying to forget the sound of those clocks, the strange faces in the stained glass, and the silent reflections that refuse to obey my movements. Tomorrow I'll have to do it again. I'm not sure how I'll handle it, but I have no choice. I'll show up, turn off the lights, lock the doors, and watch as the same things unfold. Maybe one day I'll figure out how to stop it, or maybe not. It doesn't matter. I'll do my job. I'll leave the store in the same condition I found it. That's all that matters right now. I drove into that mountain range on a Friday afternoon after hearing about some good fishing spots from a coworker. He told me about a stream where trout supposedly gathered near a small clearing in the middle of a dense patch of forest on a steep slope. I followed his directions as best I could. The drive was rough, the roads got narrow, and after a while I was barely following a faint trail meant for old trucks and off-road vehicles. By the time I parked, the sky was turning gray. I walked about an hour through thick brush, found a flat area that looked good enough to set up my tent, and planned on waking up early to fish. I never expected what came after midnight. I never expected to hear voices that had no business being there. I got there when the sun was setting behind the western slope. The place felt damp and the smell of earth was strong. There were ferns, mossy tree trunks, and a layer of leaves that stuck to my boots. The clearing was small, just enough space for my tent and a makeshift fire pit. Trees rose all around, tall and packed, forming a wall of dark silhouettes. Visibility was low, and as soon as I set down my pack, I noticed a creeping fog. It wasn't just morning mist or a bit of moisture in the air. This fog had a thickness to it. Within minutes, I couldn't see more than a few yards. Everything was quiet. There were no distant engine sounds, no human voices, no cabin lights. Just me, my tent, and that silent fog. I pulled out my tent, unrolled it, and hammered the stakes into the damp ground. My hands got muddy right away. I tossed my sleeping bag inside, along with a flashlight, a knife, and my dry clothes in a corner. I had enough water for a couple of days and some canned food. There was a small stream somewhere downhill, but I didn't feel like exploring in the dark. I wanted to rest, wake up early, and find that stream at first light. By the time I tried to light a small fire, the fog was so thick I couldn't see beyond the dim glow of my lighter. My wood shavings were slightly damp, and I struggled with the flame. Eventually, I got a weak fire going, just enough to heat some canned stew. I ate straight from the can. The food was lukewarm and tasted bland, but it filled my stomach. My plan was simple: eat, maybe read a few pages of a paperback I had in my bag, then sleep. But as I stared into the darkness beyond the flickering flame, something felt off. I couldn't pin it down right away. Everything was quiet, almost too quiet. I tried not to think about it. I climbed into my tent and zipped it shut. I lay down, my head on a small travel pillow, and tried to relax. My boots were off, resting near the entrance. I kept my flashlight close and my knife even closer. I don't usually sleep heavily in the woods. I listened for animals, for changes in the weather, for anything that might be a threat. That night, as I drifted between consciousness and shallow sleep, I remember hearing a faint rustling outside. I told myself it was just a small animal, maybe a squirrel or something similar. No big deal. The real trouble started a few hours later. I don't know the exact time because I never checked my watch, but I guess it was well past midnight. The temperature had dropped. I could feel the damp chill through the nylon of the tent. I woke up because of a sound, a whisper maybe, like a low voice carried by the wind. I listened, holding my breath. It was distant at first. I couldn't make out words. It sounded like 2 or 3 voices, all low and hushed. My heart started beating a bit faster. I told myself I was imagining it, but then I heard it again. I lay still, my eyes open in the darkness. The air felt heavy inside the tent. The fog outside seemed to press against the fabric. I unzipped the tent door a few inches and pointed my flashlight out. The beam of light caught only swirling mist. I didn't see anyone. I didn't hear footsteps, just these faint, muffled voices. They were not loud. They were not screaming. They were talking as if discussing something quietly. I couldn't understand a single word. It didn't even sound like a language I recognized. It was all murmurs, syllables, and pauses. Then I heard a soft shuffling sound, like bare feet moving over wet leaves. My throat went dry. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I turned off the flashlight, hoping to remain hidden. Maybe it was a group of hunters or some locals passing by. But this was nowhere near a trail, and no one would be walking around in that thick fog at that hour. I waited, listening. The voices drifted around me. One moment they seemed to come from my left, then from behind me. They were never too close, but never far enough for me to relax. I tried to steady my breathing. My heart was pounding. I felt sweat on my forehead and on my palms, my fingers wrapped around the handle of the knife. I was ready to yell, to shout at whoever was out there, but I held back. Maybe they hadn't noticed me. Maybe they were just passing through. But their voices didn't move away. They circled, whispering in that strange tone. I couldn't pick up a single word or phrase that made sense. It was like they were discussing something important, but doing it so quietly and in such an alien way that I couldn't even guess what it meant. Time passed slowly. The voices sometimes faded, then returned. At one point I heard what sounded like a soft knock on a tree trunk, then a reply, a low grunt, and more whispers. I tried to see shapes in the fog, but the flashlight only made the mist glow white. I saw nothing solid. No outlines of people, no animal eyes reflecting the light, just that thick, oppressive haze. I wanted to leave right then. I wanted to pack my gear and get out. But where would I go in the dark, with no trail, with that dense fog blocking my view? I'd probably stumble downhill and hurt myself. I thought about staying quiet until morning. The idea of waiting there, exposed and surrounded by these invisible voices, made my stomach turn. But I had no choice. I decided to remain still and hope they would go away. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. My chest tightened every time the voices returned. Sometimes I heard soft breathing, like someone leaning close. I would jolt and shine the flashlight in that direction, but always saw only the pale void of the mist. I tried calling out once. I said, "Hello? Who's there?" My voice sounded weak and shaky. The whispers stopped for a moment. Silence pressed down on me. I thought maybe that did it, maybe they left. But then I heard them again, quieter this time, as if mocking me, staying just out of reach. My gut told me these weren't normal people. They never laughed or raised their voices. They never cursed or said anything recognizable. There were no coughs, no sneezes, no sounds of gear or clothing rustling. Just those low whispers and faint shuffles on the ground. I kept imagining them crouching behind trees, peering through the fog, observing me, deciding what to do. Yet they never attacked, never tried to open my tent or steal my belongings. They just existed there, circling, talking in their strange way. My legs felt cramped. My neck hurt from lying stiffly. I had to change position inside the tent, but every time I moved, the fabric rustled, and the voices would pause. Then they would continue as if commenting on my movements. I imagined shapes outside, thin silhouettes gliding through the mist. I held my knife tighter. At some point I reached for my watch and pressed the button for the light. It was around 3 in the morning. I had several hours until dawn. The idea of staying in that spot made me feel sick. I reached for my boots and put them on, fumbling with the laces. The voices never got louder, never grew aggressive, but their constant presence felt like a weight on my chest. I decided to try something else. I unzipped the tent door fully and stuck my head out slowly, keeping my flashlight off. I saw only the milky white fog swirling gently. I listened. The voices were coming from my left, I thought. I turned my head, but there was nothing there. The ground was muddy, covered in leaves. I expected to see footprints or disturbed earth. Nothing. I pointed the flashlight and flicked it on for a second. I saw empty space, just swirling mist and trees looming in the background. I pulled my head back in and zipped up again. I considered packing my gear, but the idea of making noise and rustling around in the dark made me hesitate. These voices, whatever they were, might react to that. Maybe they were waiting for an excuse to confront me. I didn't know what they wanted. They didn't sound angry. They sounded focused, like people working on something delicate. That thought made me sweat more. What were they doing out there? Around 4 in the morning, I heard a new sound. Something tapped against my tent's rainfly on the outside. A gentle tap, and then a soft dragging sound. I jumped and shouted, "Hey, stop!" I scrambled for the flashlight, pointing it at the spot inside the tent where I heard the noise. Of course, I saw nothing. The outside remained hidden behind the tent walls and the fog. The voices murmured in response. I clenched my teeth so hard my jaw hurt. I stayed still again. My skin felt clammy. I was breathing through my mouth. Every few minutes, the whispers changed patterns. Sometimes there were 2 voices, sometimes 3 or 4. They rose and fell in pitch, but never got loud enough for me to identify any words. It was like listening to a strange radio transmission through heavy static. The lack of any concrete sign of who or what they were messed with my head. I kept expecting them to vanish, to leave me alone, but they didn't. I focused on my watch, waiting for the minutes to crawl by. I knew that once the sky brightened, the fog might lift, and I could find my way out of there. Maybe the voices would stop at dawn. I forced myself not to panic, just to endure. My muscles were tense, my shoulders stiff. I could barely swallow. I rested my head against the backpack to keep it still. The knife was in my hand the entire time, but what good was it against something I couldn't see? Eventually, a faint gray light filtered through the fabric of the tent. It was still foggy, but the darkness eased a little. I noticed the voices had become less frequent. I waited a bit longer, listening. The morning air felt cold. My breath made small clouds inside the tent. After several minutes of silence, I decided to move. I slowly unzipped the tent and stuck my head out. The fog was still thick, but I could make out the shape of trees better. There was no one standing around. No footprints, no trampled bushes, nothing. I looked for broken branches or signs of disturbance on the ground. I saw none. I kept my knife in hand and crawled out. The silence outside pressed against my ears. I checked my fishing gear and the food. Everything was untouched. My truck was too far away, but I could hike back. I stood there for a moment, listening hard. Just silence. My legs shook a bit as I packed my tent. I didn't bother folding it neatly. I just stuffed it into the backpack. I yanked the stakes out with trembling hands. I checked behind me every few seconds. The fog was slowly lifting, revealing the forest with more clarity. The damp leaves stuck to my pants. My boots sank slightly into the mud. Nothing and no one appeared. No whispers, no shuffling. It was as if the night had never happened, but I knew it did. I could still feel my heart beating fast. My arms felt sore from gripping the knife. I slung the backpack over my shoulder, picked up my fishing rod, and started walking back the way I came. I didn't bother trying to find that stream. I kept looking over my shoulder as I walked uphill, pushing through low branches, slipping on wet leaves, ducking under fallen trunks. I made it back to where I had parked, though it took some time. The fog thinned as I got lower on the slope. The sunlight felt weak, filtered by high clouds. I checked my watch again. It was a bit after 7. I didn't see another soul the entire hike back. The woods were quiet. No birds, no wildlife. Just the crunch of my boots and the sound of my breathing. When I reached the truck, I tossed my gear inside and started the engine. The sound of the motor felt reassuring. I drove out of there, following that rough trail until I hit the main road. I never told my coworker what I experienced. I never explained why I didn't bring back any fish or why I came back early. I just let him think I changed my mind. I still don't know what I encountered up there. I can't explain those voices, their strange sounds, the way they moved around without ever showing themselves. I don't have any proof. Nothing touched me, nothing stole from me, nothing injured me. But I felt them. I heard them. I know they were real, whatever they were. All I know is that I'm not going back. I'm done with that part of the mountain. No fish is worth another night like that. I took this job because I needed the money, and the owner promised a good paycheck if I stayed for a week. He said he would be away, and I just had to keep an eye on the mansion. He told me to check the doors, keep the halls clean, and make sure nothing got damaged. That sounded simple. He never warned me about the masks. On my first day, I arrived in the morning. The owner had already left. The place was large, silent, and well furnished. There were heavy doors, wooden floors, wide halls, and tall windows. Most rooms were empty of people, but the walls held decorations. There were paintings of landscapes, old furniture, shelves with strange objects, and masks. These masks covered almost every wall in the main hall. They were old, carved from wood or molded from some kind of clay. Some looked like they came from other countries. They had hollow eyes and painted faces. They looked old and worn out. I started my routine by walking through each room. I tested the locks, dusted a few surfaces, and made sure no windows were broken. The place was quiet. I tried to ignore the masks, but in the main hall I felt like they were staring at me. When I passed by them, I felt something in my stomach tighten. I knew they were just objects, but their empty eyes seemed to follow me. The hall had about 20 or 30 masks on the walls. Some were big, some small. They hung in rows and clusters. I tried to focus on work. I swept the floor, arranged a few chairs, wiped a table. I kept looking over my shoulder. The masks stayed still. After I finished, I decided to take a short break. I walked out of the main hall and went to a side corridor. It had a few windows and a bench. I sat there for a minute to calm down. I thought about going back in and checking if the masks were still the same. I laughed at myself for even thinking they would move. When I returned to the main hall, I froze. The masks were not in the same positions. I saw two masks that I could have sworn were near the fireplace, now hanging closer to the door. One of the larger masks, which was on the left wall, seemed lower and tilted. Another mask on the right looked like it was now facing slightly downward, as if watching me from above. I stood there, feeling my heart pound. I kept looking around, trying to see if maybe I had just remembered wrong. I was pretty sure I had the right impression before. I thought maybe I was tired. I tried not to panic. I checked the hooks on the wall. They looked solid. I touched one mask. It felt like old wood. It was cool and rough. The mask did not move when I touched it. I decided to leave the hall again, walk around, and come back. I wanted to test this strange feeling. I took a quick walk to the kitchen. It was empty. I opened the door to the backyard to let some air in. It was a cloudy day. No one was around. I returned to the main hall after a few minutes. The masks had changed position again. This time, 3 masks on the far wall were all angled at the same tilt, as if leaning to one side. Another mask, one with red paint around the eyes, now seemed closer than before. The hooks were not aligned like I remembered. It was as if the masks had shuffled themselves around. I felt sweat forming on my forehead. My fingertips felt numb. I walked slowly around the hall, watching these things from different angles. I said out loud, "What the hell is going on?" I got no answer, of course. I listened carefully. The house was quiet. I heard only my own breathing. I checked the doors again, all locked, windows closed. The masks made no sound. They were still just hanging there. I thought about leaving the mansion, but I had a job to do. I needed the money, and I was not about to run off because of some weird feeling. I decided to ignore the masks. I went upstairs to check the bedrooms. There were no masks in the bedrooms. Everything there was normal. I felt safer upstairs. I dusted a few surfaces, checked the bathrooms, ran the water to make sure the pipes were fine. Nothing strange happened there. After maybe an hour, I headed back down. The main hall waited for me. I told myself that I would just pass through quickly and go do something else. But as soon as I entered the hall, I noticed it again. The masks had changed. This time, some were arranged in a way that reminded me of faces making expressions. One mask, with a large forehead and small chin, was tilted downward, right over another mask with a larger chin. Together, they seemed like they were forming some odd pattern. Another group of masks on the opposite wall seemed closer to the floor. It was as if they had tried to line up and watch me at my own eye level. I felt a chill on my neck. I started breathing faster. My hands were shaking. I walked up to one of the masks and grabbed it. I pulled it off the wall. The hook slipped out easily, as if it was never firmly attached. I held the mask in my hands. It felt normal. Old wood, chipped paint. I placed it on a table. I wanted to see if that changed anything. If I left it there, maybe I could catch something when I came back. I took another mask down and placed it next to the first one. I did this to a few masks, trying to break whatever arrangement they were forming. After rearranging about 6 masks, I took another short break. I walked to the front door, made sure it was locked, then walked to the library. The library had no masks. It had shelves full of books, a desk, and a few chairs. I opened a window and took a deep breath. I checked my phone. No messages, no calls. The owner had told me not to worry, just to stay and keep the place in order. I wanted to call him, but I felt stupid. What would I say? That his masks were moving around? I decided to return to the hall and look closely. Maybe I would find a string or some mechanism. When I got back, the masks I had placed on the table were gone. They were back on the wall. Not in the same positions as before, but back on the wall. I felt my stomach turn. I stepped back, bumped into a chair, and almost fell. I looked at the other masks. They seemed to have moved again. One that was near the door was now facing it directly. Another was hanging closer to a lamp. I could see scratches on the wall where they had moved. It was clear they were not just shifting slightly. They were relocating themselves entirely. I tried to think of a reason. Maybe someone else was in the mansion. Maybe a secret passage allowed someone to mess with me. I decided to search the walls. I tapped the panels, pulled on shelves, looked behind curtains. I found nothing. There were no loose floorboards. The windows were locked from the inside. No footprints. Nothing. The hallway outside was empty and silent. I turned back to the main hall and watched the masks from the doorway. I stood there for a long time, just watching. They did not move while I watched. They just hung there, silent. Their empty eyes faced me. I stepped out of the room, waited a minute, and quickly popped back in. I caught a glimpse of movement. I saw one mask's position change as soon as I appeared, like it had tried to settle back in place. I stepped forward, reached out to touch it again, but as soon as my hand came close, it was perfectly still. I felt my heart beating hard. My mouth was dry. I wiped sweat from my upper lip and tried to calm down. I needed to think straight, but my mind was racing. I was alone in a house with masks that should not be moving, but they were. I tried to avoid looking at them directly. I turned my back for a moment, then spun around fast. Again, they had altered their arrangement slightly. I could not catch them in the act of moving, only find them in new positions whenever I wasn't looking. I decided to spend as little time in the main hall as possible. I moved to the kitchen, found a bottle of water in the fridge, and drank it. The water was cold. My hands shook while I held the bottle. I kept thinking about the masks. I tried to focus on my breathing. My only plan now was to get through the day and leave in the morning. I was supposed to stay for a week, but I was not sure I could handle one full night. I paced around the kitchen, trying to calm my nerves. After a while, I grabbed a broom and returned to the main hall. I pretended to be working. I swept the floor slowly, keeping my eyes on the masks. They did not move while I stared directly at them. They just hung there, pretending to be harmless decorations. I walked backward, never taking my eyes off them until I was at the doorway. Then I stepped out and in again. This time I caught them in a slightly different angle. They were playing with me, reacting to my absence and presence. I tried removing more masks from the walls, placing them on the floor. Every time I returned after leaving the room, they were back on the walls. I tried stacking them in a corner. When I came back, they were spread out again, each hung neatly but in a new pattern. I never heard a sound. They moved silently, without any trace of how they did it. My legs felt weak and I was sweating a lot. Later that afternoon, I tried locking the doors to the main hall and leaving them shut. There were 2 doors, one leading to the entrance and one leading to a corridor. I locked both. Then I waited outside for a while. When I opened the door again, I found the masks arranged in a row, all facing me at head level. It looked as if they were waiting for me to return. I stepped back and slammed the door shut again. I knew I could not stay in that mansion much longer. My contract said a week, but I planned to leave the next morning. I could not risk sleeping there. I was too afraid to try sleeping in a place where the walls changed every time I looked away. I did not trust the masks. Even though they never hurt me, they made my body ache with tension. I could feel my pulse pounding in my wrists and neck. My head started hurting from all the stress. In the early evening, I tried to eat something. The kitchen had some canned food. I opened a can of tuna and ate it cold with bread. I did not enjoy the taste. I forced it down, my hands trembling. I washed a plate and dried it, trying to focus on small tasks. Anything to calm my nerves. I checked my phone for the time. It was moving so slowly. I considered calling someone, but who would believe me? I decided to gather my belongings and keep them with me. I had a small bag with clothes and a toothbrush. I also had a flashlight. The mansion's lights were steady, but I wanted a backup. I walked upstairs and got my stuff. On my way back down, I avoided the main hall. I went around through a side corridor that connected to the entrance. I sat in the entrance foyer, listening to my own breathing. After some time, I had to pass by the main hall again. The front door and the corridor to the bedrooms were on opposite sides of it. I tried walking through it quickly. As soon as I entered, the masks were closer to the center of the room. They must have been placed on some kind of rope or hook that allowed them to move, but I saw no rope. They were all facing inward, as if forming a circle. I walked around them, keeping a distance. I tried not to blink. My throat was tight, my legs were stiff. I reached the other side and left the room. When I turned the corner, I felt a shiver run down my spine. I knew I had to face this situation for the rest of the night. I tried turning on a TV in a side room, some old television set the owner had. It just showed static. There was no cable signal, and I had no key to any car. The mansion was too isolated for a quick escape on foot in the dark. I would leave at first light. I spent the next few hours pacing around, checking doors, and trying to avoid the main hall. But the layout of the mansion forced me to cross it often. Each time I entered, the masks had arranged themselves differently. Sometimes they were all high up on the walls, facing down. Sometimes they spread out evenly, watching from all sides. Other times they gathered near a corner, as if trying to stay hidden but always in my line of sight as soon as I stepped in. My heart rate never slowed down. I felt dampness under my arms and behind my neck. I wiped my face often. My eyes stung from trying not to blink too much. I never heard a single footstep or sound that would explain their movement. The masks just changed position when I wasn't looking. They did not threaten me, but their presence felt wrong. I could not relax or think clearly in their presence. Close to midnight, I decided to wait in the entrance foyer until morning. I had a flashlight, my bag, and a chair. I positioned myself so I did not have to look directly at the main hall. I stayed there, listening for any noise. I heard nothing. The house was silent. A few times I got up and checked the main hall from a distance. I saw the masks shifting their angles each time. They never repeated the same arrangement twice. My muscles were tense and sore. I tapped my foot on the floor. I gripped the arms of my chair so hard my knuckles hurt. The air felt heavy, and the house smelled like old wood and dust. I felt thirsty and took small sips from a bottle of water. I avoided looking at my reflection in the windows. I just focused on staying awake and waiting for morning. Time passed slowly. I stood up once more, walked a few steps, then sat down again. I did this many times. The only way out was through the main door, but I did not want to run into the night and get lost. I waited, checking my phone now and then. The battery was low. The darkness outside was complete. I had no choice but to stay. I tried to keep my mind blank. If I thought too much, I would panic. I looked at my shoes, at the floor, at the empty foyer. I stretched my legs and arms. I listened for any sign of the masks moving, but I never caught any sound. They were quiet, patient, and always waiting for me to return. When I finally saw the sky lighten through a window, I felt relief. I grabbed my stuff and walked to the main door. I had the keys. I just needed to cross the main hall one last time. I stepped inside and the masks were all lined up along the walls as if in perfect order. They all faced straight ahead, eyes hollow and still. I walked quickly, keeping my head down. I reached the door, unlocked it, and stepped out. Outside, the air was cool and fresh. The silence of the early morning felt different. I locked the door behind me. I did not look back through the window. I did not want to see them again. I hurried down the path, my legs unsteady, my chest tight. I never returned to that house.